Thank you for coming. I'm glad people are here. Just as a little bit of background, especially for those of you who aren't in one of my classes, also both of my classes are here, so I hope there's not like a sharks and jets thing between you guys. So essentially the idea with this is, um, I think one of the sort of strange things about the way we teach economics, not just here, but in general, is we essentially never talk about something like, we never talk about capitalism, right? Or really never even talk about economic systems. We talk about markets, we talk about regulation, we talk about externalities, right? But these sorts of bigger picture questions of how is our society organized and what are the alternatives to how our society is organized are things that you really get in other places, right? We essentially take it for granted the way that the basic rules of the game work. And one of the consequences of that is we have some pretty, I think, concrete and powerful tools for how we explain what we take as essentially the baseline of economic reasoning, which is essentially neoliberal economic reasoning, that we explain in a lot of depth. And then and I felt this frustration when I've tried to understand the world, right? When you then look and you try to say, well, what are the alternatives? You have this sort of neoliberal construct that's in math and reasoning with empirical evidence and all this stuff. And then the alternatives are presented in like essays that are hard to read because I never learned how to read these things, right? Very, very different styles of argument. And it's difficult to understand necessarily how these things link, right? Or what the assumptions are that lead you to come to one conclusion versus another. So the goal for this lecture, which is like way too ambitious for an hour and a half, is to do some basic groundwork for a couple of alternatives to that core neoliberal framework, right? So I'm going to talk about three alternatives. These aren't the only three, but I don't know, they're three I'm talking about, right? One is sort of Anarcho-Socialism, right, or left anarchism. Another one is Anarcho-Capitalism, right, or market anarchism. And the last one is Marxism. So I'm not an expert in any of these things, right? I've read some stuff. This is my attempt to sort of reason through this. So don't take what I say as a given, but I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. Another thing I'll throw out there is I'm thinking about turning this into a class, right? To have a semester with a couple weeks on each of these sets of ideas, reading empirical evidence, etc. So any ideas you have or reactions will be really helpful for me to think about. Is that a thing that I should do? Or is that not a thing I should do? Good? Okay, we're on board with what we're doing? Okay, so I want to start with sort of the neoliberal baseline. I'm calling this a baseline because for those of us who study economics, right, this is the framework that we understand best. It's really not the baseline that most people use when they think about policy, right? Who knows what the baseline is? Most people think about policy. But essentially the neoliberal baseline, right, this is the way that we think about economies and markets in microeconomic theory, right, in most of our economic classes, is essentially to make two fundamental arguments. The first of those arguments is that decentralized decision-making, self-interested decentralized decision-making, when done in a competitive way, can result in outcomes that are best for everyone, right, that are socially optimal. The second piece of the argument is that there's certain kinds of failures that emerge out of decentralized decision-making that need correction. This makes sense? So we have this idea essentially that markets can be efficient, markets can be incredibly powerful tools to distribute resources in an effective way, and also the markets are limited, right? Markets have failures, and we have to correct those failures from something outside of markets, yes? So I want to really quickly go over that just to make sure we're on the same page, right? And this is essentially a recap of what we do, at least in my version of Micro 2, Econ 250, right? So essentially what we do, right, is we're going to say that there's three basic jobs that an economy needs to do well in order for the economy to function, right? One job is we need to decide how to produce. Another is we need to decide how to distribute. We need to decide what to produce. And we need to decide how to distribute the output that we produce. Yes? So let's say we're in a super, super tiny toy economy, right, with two people, with two inputs of production, right? We'll say labor and capital. The two people are going to be Zena and Yvette, right? And we have two kinds of output. Let's say that we have strawberries and we have blueberries. Good? So when we think about how to produce, we think about how firms are going to make decisions about how to produce in a decentralized market. The fundamental argument we'll make is that from the perspective of any given firm, right, when we have a decentralized market,
The wages that you have to pay to workers, the rental rate that you have to pay to capital is going to be outside of your control, right? And so as a consequence, when we think about, well, how do we decide whether to produce 100 pounds of strawberries with labor or with capital? All we're going to do is we're going to say, well, we should pick whatever is cheapest for us, right? So what that looks like graphically, right? I have labor and capital. I'm making strawberries. I have a bunch of different combinations of labor and capital, all of which are going to produce the same amount of output, right? Let's say they're going to produce 100 pounds of strawberries, right? And what is it that I need to do? How do I pick what's cheapest? Yeah, hit me, Milo.
It's like the MRFB.
Yeah, this isn't quite MRP yet, right? This is
Yeah.
this is MRTS,
Take
right?
the derivative of this function.
That's right. You take the derivative of this thing, right? Essentially, what you're going to do is you're going to say, well, I'm going to pick whatever is the lowest total cost for a given wage rate and rental rate, right? I've got a bunch of equivalent cost options with basically straight lines, right? Where the slope of that line is going to be W over R, right? And I'm going to pick the option where my MRTS equals W over R, right? What's my MRTS? It's the marginal product of labor over the marginal product of capital. In other words, it's the number of strawberries another worker would produce versus the number of strawberries another unit of capital would produce, right? I'm going to hire where this is equal to W over R, right? The argument is that if I'm in the blueberry market, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I might have a different production function, right? Right, but I'm also going to have the same wage and rental rate if I'm using the same kind of labor and the same kind of capital, right? I'm going to choose the amount of workers, the amount of capital, so that my MRTS is also equal to W over R, right? And this gives us this miraculous outcome, right? Which is essentially what we're going to say is the relative productivity of labor and capital in strawberries is exactly the same as the relative productivity of labor and capital in blueberries, right? What that's going to give us is that the way that individual firms decide to produce strawberries and blueberries using labor and capital doesn't allow for some alternative where I could move workers from strawberries to blueberries and capital from blueberries to strawberries and get more of both, right? Essentially what's going to happen is because these two firms are looking at a common market, they're going to end up choosing their inputs efficiently. We can see this, which is going to be helpful for no one because Edgeworth boxes are difficult, right? But if we thought about sort of how we're going to allocate all of the labor and capital in our economy, right? What this is going to mean is that we have a strawberry isoquant that touches our blueberry isoquant in just one place. All of the options that would make more strawberries would make fewer blueberries and vice versa. Yes? This makes sense? This sound vaguely familiar to you guys? Okay, beautiful. So this is how we produce. This is why our choice about how to produce is going to be efficient, right? We have common prices. The prices are going to pass information from one industry to another about how useful labor is, how useful capital is. That information is going to push these different industries to conserve the more useful input, right? We then have a question how to distribute, right? So let's say that we've got Xena and we've got Yvette. How does Xena decide how many strawberries and blueberries to buy, given some income? Here, Richard.
But don't be based on her MRS.
Yeah, exactly. Right? She's going to choose what she wants, right? She's going to pick her favorite out of the things she can afford, right? What does it mean to pick your favorite? It means that if she's got some budget constraint, right, where the price of blueberries times B plus the price of strawberries times S equals her income, right? She's going to choose the option that makes her happiest, which is going to be where her MRS, her marginal rate of substitution, right, the number of strawberries she would give up to get an additional blueberry, right, is equal to the number of strawberries she'd have to give up to get an additional blueberry, right? Beautiful. And then if we think about Yvette, Yvette is going to do exactly the same thing, right? She's going to have her own budget constraint. She's going to have her own MRS. Her MRS is also going to be PB over PS. The consequence of this is going to be that even though Zena and Yvette aren't talking to each other, Zena and Yvette aren't thinking about each other, Zena and Yvette don't care about each other, right? When Zena decides that she's allergic to strawberries and so she wants more blueberries and fewer strawberries, Yvette is going to respond by buying fewer blueberries and more strawberries, right? Because the price signal is going to be passed between these two people. This makes sense? And so we're going to have another form of efficiency. We'll call this allocative efficiency, right? The idea here is essentially that if I think about all the ways of distributing blueberries and strawberries between these two people, I'm going to end up with some allocation where I couldn't make one of them happier without making the other one sadder. Yeah? Okay, beautiful. And then in the middle here, now we can get to MRT, right? In the middle here, we ask, okay, well, how many blueberries and how many strawberries should we produce, right? Well, when a firm is deciding how much to produce, what they're going to do, if they don't have any control over the price, they're going to produce until their marginal cost is equal to the price, right? They're going to produce every unit of output that's profitable for them to make. This make sense? So I'm going to have a price of strawberries and a price of blueberries. Let's say for blueberries, right? I've got some price of blueberries. I've got some marginal cost of blueberries. I'm going to produce where price equals marginal cost, right? And for strawberries, let's say that strawberries are cheaper, right? I'm going to produce where price equals marginal cost here too, right? What this is going to tell me is that the price of blueberries over the price of strawberries is going to equal the marginal cost of blueberries over the marginal cost of strawberries. This is going to tell me that the value, the relative value to consumers of blueberries and strawberries is going to have to equal the cost of producing blueberries versus strawberries, right? The amount of labor and capital it takes to produce blueberries and strawberries. This make sense? So what this is going to mean is I couldn't make everybody in my society happier by reallocating workers and capital from the blueberry fields to the strawberry fields or vice versa. Yeah? And our little picture that we can draw for this, that you guys hopefully have fond memories of and not sad memories of, we can basically say that we've got a range of different total blueberries and strawberries we could produce given all the resources we have. We're going to pick the ones that make us happiest. Yes? Okay, beautiful. So this is sort of a really quick and kind of techie reminder of the first sort of neoliberal framework, right? The framework for why markets can work. And I want to dwell on this for a second, right? Because the argument here is kind of magical. The argument here is quite complex, right? I'm showing you this in a very, very simplified form. But in order to appreciate, right, other schools of thought, we need to understand sort of how big the claim is being made here, right? The claim being made here is that when we think about these major decisions that the economy has to make, right? How do we allocate labor and capital? How do we decide how much to produce or what to produce? How do we decide who gets what? We're allowing these decisions to be made without any particular decision maker, right? What we're doing is we're taking each subcomponent of that decision, we're allowing an individual to make each subcomponent of that decision without thinking at all about the big picture, without thinking at all about how they affect other people, just thinking about what they like, what they want, what their goals are, and thinking about prices. This makes sense? When I'm a blueberry farmer, and I think, should I hire another worker or should I hire another tractor? I don't think, oh, well, who else needs this tractor and who else needs this worker? I just think about, well, what's a cheaper way for me to make a blueberry, right? But if I discover that I really need more workers in the blueberry fields this year, for whatever reason, and I start hiring more workers, that pushes up wages. That increase in wages causes the strawberry farmers to move over to using tractors instead of workers. This makes sense? They're going to respond to my situation without doing anything about it. Right? When we think about how consumers are responding, if blueberries become more expensive because there's a blueberry blight, right? We don't need to think about, well, who should get the blueberries and who shouldn't get the blueberries. Prices go up. People who can easily avoid buying blueberries will stop buying blueberries. People who find it more desirable, right, who are less willing to give up blueberries won't. This makes sense? So the argument here is we can essentially have these very, very complex decisions being made step by step by step with nobody at all being the decision maker, right? There's a famous essay, I don't know if any of you have seen it or heard it, called I, Pencil, that walks through essentially all of the components, right, that go into making a pencil. And the argument here is, you might think, oh, well, pencil's really, really simple, right? Who knows how to make a pencil or who's in charge of the process is the CEO of like Pencil Corporation, right? But if you actually think about it, you need people mining graphite. You need people building the tools that are used to mine graphite. You need people logging, right? And building the tools that are used to refine wood into pencil-shaped objects, right? You need truckers. You need, international shipping. You need this massive global supply chain that includes millions and millions of people. And there's not a single human being on Earth who understands all of the components that go into the supply chain. This makes sense? It works without anybody being in charge. So the neoliberal argument is essentially to say, this thing here is this incredible machinery that allows a complex economy to happen, to emerge out of individual decisions. Emerge out of decisions where people are only responsible for the choices that reflect the information that they personally have. Yeah? The other side of the neoliberal argument, right, which is just as important, is the argument about how it goes wrong. Right? And we can talk about basically three major ways that this goes wrong. So the first way that this can go wrong is that I might make a decision facing prices that don't include all of the information that's relevant to my decision, right? And I won't draw a graph for all of these because the point isn't to recap 250, right? So one failure mode, what we call externalities. The idea here is that when I'm thinking, oh, do I buy strawberries or do I buy blueberries? I don't think about a question like, I can't think of a great externality for either of these, right? But let's say that strawberries make me incredibly flatulent, right? And then I'm just going to make everyone around me like suffer and pass out. I won't worry about that. That's their problem, right? I don't have to pay for that, right? Or more realistically, let's say that when we're deciding how do we produce blueberries, instead of thinking about it as labor versus capital, let's say it's labor versus pesticides, right? And if I use more pesticides in my blueberry field, that kills bees that are needed to pollinate the strawberry fields. I don't need to worry about that. That's not my problem, right? And so I'm going to use pesticides until the value of $1 worth of pesticides is equal to the value of $1 worth of labor to me, ignoring the fact that the pesticides cause problems for someone else. This makes sense? So this is going to be a major problem. Another big problem, information asymmetry. This is a fancy way of saying lying is a problem, right? So let's say when you go to the grocery store, it turns out that, you look at you've got two different kinds of blueberries, right? One from Piedmont Farms and the other from Sun Valley Farms. And it turns out that one of these blueberries has been treated with blue dye that makes them look attractive, but is going to give you cancer. And the other one hasn't been treated with that blue dye. And they look exactly the same, and they taste exactly the same, and you can't tell, right? If there's not a sign that says cancer berries versus non-cancer berries, you're going to pick up the cancer berries with just the same likelihood as the non-cancer berries, right? And that's not going to be because that reflects your preferences between cancer berries and no cancer berries, right? It's because you don't know what you're buying, right? If you go buy a used car and the used car looks good to you, but the owner knows and you don't know that, they recently replaced all of the belts in the engine with zip ties, right? And it's going to work for 10 minutes until you get off the lot and then everything's going to fall apart, right? You're not going to be buying the zip tie car versus the good car based on your preferences. You're going to be buying it based on your ignorance, right? The fact that when people don't understand what they're buying, their choices aren't going to reflect their actual preferences. What we're going to end up with is an economy dominated by cheap, fake, shitty, dangerous stuff, unless there's tools that allow us to distinguish between the cheap stuff and the good stuff. Does this make sense? A last problem we can have is market power. So the idea with market power is all of the beautiful graphs that I drew before assume that everybody takes prices, right? Wages, rental rates, prices of goods as a given, right? They react to those prices, but they don't think about their influence on those prices. If I can't actually influence prices, if I'm a monopolist, then I'm not going to produce where price equals marginal cost. I'm not just going to react to prices. I'm going to try to shape the prices in a direction that's useful for me. This makes sense? So if I'm the only seller of a good, I'm going to charge too much for that good, more than it costs me to produce. If I'm the only buyer of a good, I'm going to buy it for less than it's worth to me, right, in order to keep prices low. Yeah? Okay, and then the last thing is inequality. When we think about, the efficiency argument I just made, right? The efficiency argument I just made boils down to saying that if the first three things here aren't true, right? If these aren't problems, then the outcome of this decentralized market process for deciding who gets what is going to result in something that's not worse than an alternative from everybody's perspective, right? There's not some other option on the table that would make everybody better off. There can be options on the table that would make some people much, much better off at the cost of making other people very slightly worse off, right? So, give kind of a horrible personal example. Our car's breaking down, right? The windows don't roll up and down anymore, and it's probably like the steering's going to go next. So we decided to buy a new car. We're looking at like a Hyundai Ioniq that costs $30,000. We could buy a Nissan Leaf, right? We're excited about the electric car thing. We could buy a Nissan Leaf for $15,000. The reason we like the Ioniq better, it's got better range, right? It's got about 150 miles more range. I don't know, it's a little more comfortable. It's easier to fit a car seat in the back, right? There's some good reasons. Right now, if you donate $3,000 to the Against Malaria Foundation, they can use that money to provide enough preventative health care for children in Nigeria to statistically save a person's life, right? So us deciding, well, I kind of want to be able to go visit my parents in Santa Barbara and come back on one charge, not have to find a charging station up there. And I don't want to have to cram the car seat, into this car. It'd be kind of nice to have this bigger and better car. I'm essentially deciding that those conveniences are worth the lives of 5 children, right? That's pretty monstrous. It's monstrous in a way that we all are monstrous on a regular basis, right? And the reason is because in the way that resources are allocated, my preferences just matter dramatically more than the preferences of those children in Nigeria because I command vastly more resources, right? So that's not inefficient. I would actually be worse off if I had to get the Nissan Leaf. But we might say that that's pretty unjust. Does this make sense? So the neoliberal argument essentially says, it doesn't say that these problems are ignorable or unimportant. What it says is these are the problems that markets can't solve, that decentralized processes can't solve, and so we solve these problems with centralized processes, right? If we want to worry about externalities, we regulate, right? Or we put taxes. We say, if you're going to emit carbon, you need to pay a carbon tax. Or we're going to say it's illegal for you to dump fats down your drain that are going to plug up the drains for everybody else, right? It's illegal to dump toxins in the ocean, etc. Right? Information asymmetry. We'll say false advertising is illegal, right? You can be sued for false advertising. There's certain sorts of disclaimers you have to put, right? You have to say that X product might cause cancer, etc. Right? Market power. We're going to have regulations not allowing companies to buy their competitors to gain more ability to change prices, right? Or when we have monopolies, we're going to have regulatory boards that decide what prices they can charge, right? And for inequality, we can have progressive taxation, right? Instead of trusting people to sort of be generous on their own, right? We can say, well, you're going to have to pay a higher tax rate to distribute money to someone who has less resources, right? To have a more equal distribution of resources. This make sense? So this is sort of the framework of the economy that I've just quickly gone over, right? That you guys are hopefully pretty familiar with, right? From your time as econ majors. So let's talk about some alternatives, right? Some other ways to think about the same set of problems. So the first one I want to talk about is anarchism or anarcho-socialism. So this is a set of ideas, right? It's continuing to evolve. It's a set of ideas that started in the early 1800s that essentially argues that the way that we ought to run an economy is much like the sort of neoliberal baseline, based on decentralization, but instead of decentralization built around competition, it's decentralization built around cooperation, right? So the idea is that we should have decentralized communities that are themselves self-governing and have something like free entry and exit for individuals, right? So you have to sign up for certain sorts of constraints placed on you by your society, by your community, but you can choose what community you belong to. This make sense? And most people in the anarchist tradition view market forces, the market forces that we just talked about, as not sort of a tool of liberation, not part of being free from constraints, but being constraints, right? Being part of the problem. This make sense? So I want to walk through some of these arguments, and I'm going to start by thinking about market power, okay? So the story that we tell, right, the neoliberal story, if we think about market power, let's say that we imagine the emergence of capitalism, right? When we go from having lots of isolated communities who have their own, basically are self-sufficient, right, have a handful of people within the community that are embodying its role, to having something like a nationally integrated economy, right, with competition across communities and within communities. Let's say just, make it kind of foolishly simple. Let's imagine that we have a society where most people are fisher people and there's one person in each community that makes boats. Make sense? So if we thought about the boat builder market, right, where we have a number of boats and we have the price, we think about a community where there's just one person who makes boats, right? We might imagine that that one person who makes boats has a upward sloping marginal cost, right? And that there's demand for boats that's downward sloping, right? Right, both because maybe there's some people who can afford more for their boats than others, but also because if boats are really expensive, you might have a bunch of fisher people all crowded onto the same boat, right? Or taking turns with it, etc. Good? Okay. So in our classic neoliberal understanding of how people make decisions, right? Is the boat builder going to pick price equals marginal cost? No, absolutely not, right? Because they could make more money charging more. Right? We don't need to dwell on exactly, calculating how much they would charge. And we can, because you guys are familiar with it. Right? We basically say that they're going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. They're going to set some price like this. They're going to set some quantity like this. Right? The reason they're going to do this is that they can make more profit, right, by charging a price higher than marginal cost and selling fewer boats. On board? And this is going to create a deadweight loss, right? Society as a whole is going to be poorer because there's going to be some people who would have benefited from getting a boat who aren't going to get a boat at that higher price. Yeah? Okay, beautiful. And then if we think, well, what happens if we, build some roads or we have communication networks that allow people not just to buy from their own boat builder, but to buy from the boat builder in the next town over or the next town over, right? Let's say we get a little bit of competition. Well, we would say what's going to happen here is that the demand curve for any particular boat builder is going to get a lot flatter, right? Because if I charge too much, my customers are just going to go to, take the hit and go get a boat from somebody else, right? So I'll end up with a flatter demand curve. Well, it's flatter demand curve, right? Flatter marginal revenue. I'm going to have a price that's closer to marginal cost, right? If I get enough competition, I can actually get all the way to a price equal to marginal cost, right? Hit nirvana of having an efficient market. This make sense? We're all familiar and comfortable with this story, right? Okay, beautiful. So the idea here is, right, because we've assumed that boat builders are going to act selfishly and rationally in order to maximize their profits, we assume that increasing competition, right, allowing people to trade across communities is going to result in a more efficient outcome, right? Lower prices, higher quantities, right? More surplus going to the masses rather than the boat builder. Yeah? Okay. So the anarchist critique of this, or an anarchist critique of this, is to say, why is it we assume that this is what the boat builder will do absent competition, right? We assume that because we assume the boat builder's goal when they're selling their boats is to maximize the profit they get from selling boats, right? But let's say that the boat builder, if their kids get married, they're going to marry other people in the community. Let's say that the boat builder, when the boat builder's roof gets a leak, needs their neighbors to come help them out. What else might the boat builder care about? Yeah.
Like not having like homeless people on the street and stuff.
Yeah, they might care about their community doing better. They might also care about their community liking them, right? Not thinking they're an asshole. They might care about people not gossiping about them behind their backs, right? They might care about people not, burning their shop down, right, out of anger because they're charging too much. This make sense? So if we actually think about what's going to happen here in this community, right? People aren't living on the graph, they're living in real world, right? They're living in the real world where they have the capacity to do a lot of things other than setting prices and buying and selling, right? People could boycott the boat builder. People could yell at the boat builder. People could tell the boat builder what a wonderful guy that boat builder is and how much they appreciate the low prices for the boat and really puff up that boat builder's ego, right? So if we think about what might happen, we could imagine essentially the competitive price and the monopolist price as two poles, right, with different communities landing in different points on these poles on the basis of how those particular communities function, right? Some communities might be really good at figuring out ways to give their individual members the incentive to do the right thing, right, the right thing for the community, and get pretty close to a competitive price with one seller. Others might not, right? Might be getting pretty close to a monopolist price. This make sense? So it might essentially say that, right, the assumption of human selfishness we're making here is a little too strong. Now, so far, that's like an argument for why maybe we can get away with not having competition, right? But let's think about the argument for why we might actually not want market competition. So we were talking about the question of what price is the boat builder going to charge. Let's think about some other decisions the boat builder might make. Let's say that as a boat builder, I can either get my wood by going out into the forest, only finding dead trees, only cutting down the dead trees, right, leaving healthy trees alone, or I can just cut down the closest trees to my boat building shop, right? And if I cut down the closest trees to my boat building shop, that's going to mean that there's like fewer animals, right? There's a worse environment for other people. My neighbors aren't going to be able to gather acorns, whatever, right? I'm making up a dumb scenario here, right? If I'm the only boat builder in my community, the people who are buying my boats are my neighbors, right? And we have a relationship. Do you think that I'm more or less likely to put that extra effort into going out and finding dead trees? All right?
Yeah.
If I'm building my boats in a way that causes problems for the people who are buying my boats, it's a lot more likely they're going to say something to me, push back on me, right? On the other hand, if I'm building my boats and selling them to people all over the place, right? People who aren't near my community, who aren't affected by my externalities, they might care a lot less about those externalities than the people who are close to me. On top of this, if I have competition, right? Let's say that, okay, so we've talked about sort of there being one marginal cost. Let's say there's two marginal costs. There's the marginal cost of clear cutting your forest, and there's the marginal cost associated with, right, only using dead trees. In a competitive market, someone who doesn't do the cheapest thing is going to be selling their boats more expensive than everyone else. They can't do it. They don't have the scope to do it. They're going to get driven out of business. This makes sense? If we're in a community, right, where I'm the only option and you're my only option, then we have the capacity as a community to say, yeah, we're going to pay more for this guy's boats because he does things right. This makes sense? So we might be able to solve problems like externalities or information asymmetry, right, through the same mechanisms that we would use to solve problems like market power, right, through essentially consensus building mechanisms, right, through people being accountable to their neighbors. This makes sense? So I was looking for, whether there's any good empirical tests of this question, right? The market power question or the externalities question. I couldn't find anything on this. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But there's a somewhat related thing. Have any of you heard about the tragedy of the commons? Anyone know what that is? So the idea with the tragedy of the commons is, right, let's imagine that we've got some common resource. Something like we're all like living on a lake, right? And the more that I fish from the lake, the fewer fish there are for you, and the more fish you take, the fewer there are for me. Well, if we do a simple game theory analysis of this, the conclusion we're going to come to is everyone's going to fish too much, right? Wipe out all the fish, we're going to destroy the common resource. This makes sense? That's the tragedy, right? It's individually rational for all of us to take too much, even if it's collectively rational for us all to restrain our taking. Well, there's an economist, actually the first woman to ever win the Nobel Prize, named Eleanor Oster. She's awesome. And I got her name wrong, Eleanor Ostrom. She's still awesome, right? Who actually did some ethnographic research to ask, in communities where there's important commons, what do people actually do? And what she found is that across the board, the most common thing is that communities that have common resources, and have had common resources for a while, create social norms around how and when to use those resources that pretty closely match the efficient level of taking. Right? Essentially, they're able to solve these tragedy of the common problems by giving each other the stink eye if you catch too many fish, right? Or encouraging people to take fewer fish, or having a set of expectations for people around who should do what. This make sense? Okay. So the argument here, right, is essentially that if we imagine solving our problems, instead of having people competing with each other to maximize their own self-interest, right, if we imagine people trying to solve problems by working things out communally, right, working things out through discussion, actually trying to figure out the shared allocation problems, we might imagine that some of these problems, rather than being things that we can regulate away after the fact, are things that we can solve through the process of economic production. Yeah? Now, a last argument that anarchists will make related to this, I mean, not the last, a last argument I'm going to talk about that anarchists make, right, is to talk about basically the question. So if we think about the neoliberal baseline as being about saying we're essentially going to harness people's self-interest to, give people the choices to make where their self-interest is all they need to worry about, put people in a structure where their self-interest is going to lead them to make the right decisions, right? When we think about this as essentially being focused on communal interest or something, there might be a question, well, what happens to self-interest in an anarchist society? Another critique that anarchists will make of capitalism or neoliberalism is that neoliberalism doesn't just use selfishness, neoliberalism produces selfishness. This makes sense? That being in a market economy turns us into market people, and market people do things selfishly. So I want to give like a really simple, embarrassingly simple game theory of what this might mean, right? Let's imagine that there's two kind of personalities that a person can have, right? Call the first one being sharp, right? If you're sharp, you've basically got an entrepreneurial mindset. You're looking out for opportunities to gain advantage, right? You're looking to change the way things are done in ways that benefit you. You're willing to take advantage of other people if that's going to be helpful for you. You're willing to break rules if that's going to be helpful for you. This make sense? And we can imagine that the other way you could be is to be a square, right? If you're a square, you're someone who cares what other people think about you. You're someone who doesn't like to rock the boat. You're someone who checks in with other people before you do stuff. This make sense? Okay, beautiful. Then we can imagine, ask ourselves, well, what happens when sharps and squares interact? And what I might think, is two things. One is that when you get two squares together, things are going to go pretty good, right? No one's going to try to take advantage. People are going to cooperate pretty easily, right? You're going to have like a corn husking festival or, knitting circle, and everyone's going to tell fun stories, boring stories, right? It's going to be fun. So maybe we get a payoff of like 7-7. Whereas when you get two sharps together, right, it's a little harder for two sharps to trust each other. It might be harder to cooperate. So we might have a slightly lower payoff for a sharp interacting with a sharp. Okay, so far? The other thing we might say is that when a sharp interacts with a square, things are going to go a lot better for the sharp than the square, right? If I imagine one person who's sort of willing to fudge the truth, willing to do innovative stuff, willing to be entrepreneurial, willing to break the rules, and another person who tends to basically assume other people are trustworthy, do what they're told, not rock the boat, this person's gonna win in a lot of interactions, right? So we might imagine something like this as a payoff structure. Yeah? Okay. Well, what I just wrote on the board is prisoner's dilemma, right? If we think about a single period game, a single interaction, what's going to happen? Well, if I know that I'm facing a sharp, I really prefer to be a sharp, right? If I know I'm facing a square, I definitely still prefer to be a sharp, right? And the same is true for the other player. And so as a consequence, we'll say, in single one-off interactions, people are going to be better off as sharps, right? On the other hand, one of the ways we've talked about solving the prisoner's dilemma, right, one of the reasons that we don't always screw each other over all the time, is that if we're going to interact with each other over and over and over and over again, and after one time of getting screwed over by someone, you don't want to cooperate with them anymore, then it's much easier for the sustainable equilibrium to be for everyone to choose to be a square. This makes sense because getting that payoff of 10 once and losing the relationship forever is less valuable than getting that higher payoff forever. Yeah? So if we think about what kind of people emerge out of a competitive society versus out of a communal society, well, if you're in a communal society that doesn't have the trade, just has the one boat maker and the couple of fisher people and the one house builder or whatever, right? You're a society with lots and lots and lots of repeated interactions, right? Lots and lots of costs and social consequences for you to behave in sharp behavior, engage in sharp behavior. And so that's going to be a society where people are going to raise their kids to be squares. People look around and they say, who are the most successful people in my society? It's going to be squares, right? In a society where we interact with new people all the time and we're engaged in market competition, where there's a payoff to deciding that the guy that I've been going to for my boats is actually not giving me the better deal and I should go somewhere else. That's going to be a society with lots and lots and lots of one-off interactions, right? And lots of room for entrepreneurship. That's going to be a society that breeds sharps. The most successful people in our society are going to be sharps. The people you're going to want your kids to emulate are going to be sharps. The values we're going to end up teaching are going to be sharp values. This makes sense? So the argument is essentially that by incentivizing certain kinds of self-interested behavior, and I should say creative behavior and entrepreneurial behavior and innovative behavior, in a market society we get more of that. This makes sense? And that makes it harder for people to engage in the kind of cooperation that makes non-market societies or pre-market societies work. So one little example of this, and then I'll stop yammering you guys, right? One little example of this, there's a economic historian, Carl Polanyi. He wasn't an anarchist, but he's sort of very influential among anarchists. Wrote a book called The Great Transformation about basically the way that the emergence of capitalism in England changed English society. And one of the things he talked about is England had these poor laws, actually adopted these poor laws called the Speedham laws, at the sort of emergence of capital markets when there started being this growth of inequality. And the way that the poor laws work is that essentially each parish would decide some minimum income, right? Let's say $5 a day. And if your employer paid you less than the minimum income, the parish would have to top you off to get to $5 a day. So if your employer paid you $4 a day, you'd get $1 from the parish, you'd get $5 a day. Your employer pays you $2 a day, the parish gives you $3, you get $5 a day. And especially those of you in labor economics hearing this, you're gonna be like, this is obvious what we should do, right? We're gonna pay people $0 an hour, and they're gonna get $5 from the parish, and that's what everyone's gonna do, right? At least anybody who's gonna get paid below that minimum, they shouldn't get paid anything, right? Why on earth would you do such a thing? And it's a terribly designed law, right? Totally incentive incompatible. It took hundreds of years for this thing to fall apart. And the reason is that in the society that law was enacted in, at least according to Polanyi, right? I haven't done any fact-checking on Polanyi, right? But at least according to Polanyi, people just didn't think that way, right? People didn't respond to incentives the way that we do now. As the society became more and more market-oriented, as capitalism emerged, those poor laws became more and more dysfunctional because people actually responded to the incentives, right? People actually did what those laws are pushing them to do. But at the beginning of this, if you ask, well, how much do I pay the people working my land? The answer would be, well, there's customary amounts. There's amounts that my grandparents paid the people who work their land. If I pay less than that, people are going to think I'm a jackass, right? If people think, well, should I tell my landlord to pay me less so that I can get from the poor laws and maybe he can give me some milk, or give me a back rub or something to make it up to me, they're just not thinking that way. Right? They're thinking in terms of what's customary, how does my society work, what's normal, what makes me respected, right? So when people aren't thinking in terms of incentives and aren't responding to incentives, they don't necessarily do things that they're incentivized personally to do that aren't in society's best interest. This make sense? Okay. So to sum up sort of the anarchist argument, right, the anarchist critique, what this anarchist argument is saying is essentially that the way that we get something like a genuinely productive or flourishing society, right, a society that makes people genuinely well off, is that we can't just leave each individual, responsible for their own decisions. We need to make collective decisions. We need to make collective decisions at a scale where people can engage in discussion, where social norms can emerge, right, where humans can do this thing that humans are really good at, which is figuring out creative solutions around problems to get everybody on board. And then when we think about what markets do, markets are destabilizing to those things because they give individuals and societies ways to opt out of their social contracts, opt out of their social norms at low cost, and that can cause the whole thing to unravel. Does this make sense? They'll also argue, partially historically and partially just as a factual question, right, that whereas economists tend to think about free trade as the default state, right? You take away laws and what you get is a market. Anarchists tend to think about it the opposite way. They think about markets as things that are imposed by states on communities. So there's he's like a semi-anarchist. What even is it? A historian, James C. Scott, who wrote a book called Seeing Like a State. And one of the arguments that he made is that one of the ways that societies, small-scale societies, insulate themselves from markets is by making themselves incomprehensible to others. So you look at France pre-revolution, and you look at how much do people owe in taxes to their landlord in different places. And you might say, over here they owe this, 2 ladles of grain, and over here they owe 3 ladles of grain. But you actually dig into the details, and over here a ladle means like a heaping spoonful. And over there, it means that you level off the spoonful. And over here, you level off the spoonful with a sharp implement, which pushes some of the grain down and gives more of the grain to the landlord. And over there, you do it with a blunt instrument that keeps more for the peasants, right? So it's different everywhere. Everyone has a different system. Everyone has different rules. And that makes it almost impossible for someone sitting in Paris to be like, damn, you can get really good rents over in Burgundy. I should buy some Burgundian land and just really eat up these profits. Because they can't have any idea what a Burgundian bushel of wheat means compared to a Alsace-Lorrainian bushel of wheat, right? What creates a common market is doing things like saying everybody has to use the metric system, right? We're going to define a meter and have a meter be the same thing everywhere. We're going to define a kilogram and have a kilogram be the same thing everywhere. We're going to define property ownership in the same way everywhere, right? So that owning an acre of land here means the same thing as over there. We're going to do surveys to figure out who owns what land, right? And that sort of homogenization is necessary for markets to form. It doesn't come from people wanting it. It comes from states imposing it. Okay. This make sense? Yeah.
Probably a question.
Yeah.
Would be a long answer. So. Okay.
Good.
It's my understanding of left-wing anarchism, and there's obviously a million definitions, everyone believes their own thing. It's is that there's no markets.
Yeah.
Right. And that people just if you don't make food, like you get food, your job is making boats, you don't sell the boats. How is it like decided like how many boats are needed? Keeping with our boat example.
Yeah.
Because, and I don't know, like if anyone's on Twitter, but people, there's like these searches, like, what do you want to be? And like the anarcho-commune, and everyone says like, I want to be a poet, I want to be a teacher.
It says I want
No
to be a
one
trash
says like,
collector.
yeah, I want to be like a trash collector, I want to work in a mine. So it's like, how are jobs,
Yes.
allocated? How is it decided? Like, we will need 100 votes.
So I think, and this is going to be kind of a obnoxious, any actual anarchists in the room are probably going to be mad at me for this answer, right? I think that there's a distinction to draw between what I see as like anarchist-ish historians, people who look at actual societies that have some of these properties and ask how they work, versus this sort of like intellectual fantasy of like what would a perfect society look like. So the intellectual fantasy version is like everyone just does what they want, and we all love each other so much that if I like notice that there's sewage flowing through the streets, my love for my neighbors just overwhelms me, and I stick on some rubber gloves and just stick my head in that sewage, deal with it, right? And people just care so much about each other that these things don't even become a problem. We'll totally have wastewater treatment workers who don't get paid, right, or get paid the same as poets. The sort of more real world, if we ask sort of what do pre-market societies actually do, right? How does the boat maker get compensated? The answer would be, I mean, it varies, right? We're talking about thousands of different societies. But what you might not have is something like a market in like a, if you think about the stock market as the biggest extreme where the price is changing on a day-to-day or a minute-to-minute, millisecond-to-millisecond basis, right? What you might have is something much more like there is a customary offer that you get to make and people are going to think you're good, right? So I'm going to make you a boat. You're going to owe me now because I made you a boat. But the things that you owe me are like well understood and aren't necessarily going to fluctuate with supply and demand, right? So we're going to sort of like have a social negotiation of some kind, right? Which might mean me snubbing you if you're rude to me or whatever, right? That like making you a boat means that you should give me half your catch for the next year, right? And asking for half your catch for 2 years would be really greedy of me, and you only giving me half your catch for a month would be really greedy of you. Does this make sense? How does that sort of price get negotiated? That price that gets negotiated through people being unhappy and voicing their unhappiness and having people either agree with them or not agree with them. Right? The boat maker being like, you guys are screwing me over and not making boats for a while, and having everyone feel like, man, I'm really sorry that we screwed over the boat maker. Now I really wish I had a boat, and being more generous. This makes sense? So it's not a market because it's not right. It's not this sort of like governed by supply and demand price moves without anyone making choices. But it also isn't like a utopian perfect equality. Everyone chooses exactly what they do. Yeah, Reggie?
Yeah, but for like the sewage issue, it was
Yeah.
really like a social hierarchy, which is like, because I feel like this system is what we've had for the majority of history before like the Industrial Revolution. But there was like a very strict social hierarchy.
100%.
Like, some people were stuck doing the worst parts.
This is something that I find frustrating about reading anarchists. Like people will talk about like, for example, Plains Indians as an example of an anarchist society. Which is, I mean, honestly, a quite good example, depending on what specific groups you're talking about. So I think, what's the group? I think the Comanche are often used as an example, where there's no sort of central hierarchy in most Comanche bands. There's no like chief that gives everyone instructions. But there's totally slavery, right? So there's this sort of like freedom and lack of social hierarchy, but with social stratification and people on the bottom who do a lot of the dirty work. Same thing with the Vikings. People often use the Vikings as an example of this, right? Viking raiders would show up outside of Paris. The king of France would be like, can I talk to the king of this Viking band? And they'd be like, we don't have a king. We're a bunch of dudes. We like each other. We kill people together. It's great, right? But then they have a bunch of slaves that are like making their boats. So yeah, absolutely. One of the ways that you can solve some of these problems is you can say, well, certain people are designated to be dirty work only, and that's great for everybody else, and it's awesome, right? That's something that'll happen in an anarchist society. I think the sort of communitarian or anarchist rebuke to that would be to say, when you have competition between societies and the ability of people to move between societies, someone who's getting a raw deal over here is going to want to go over there. So an example that sometimes comes up is in the Middle Ages, there were, especially in Germany, there were free states, especially along the Baltic Sea, that were essentially formed when like people would run away from their feudal overlords and just like hang out together in like a bog. And over time, that bog would become a populated place where people could do what they want and not have feudal overlords telling them what to do. And those were often like free from central authority and often run on fairly Republican principles, right? So the idea is essentially that when you have social hierarchies in the system, because there's no central state that's powerful enough to enforce the same social hierarchy everywhere, people on the bottom of that hierarchy can look for a better deal elsewhere. Yeah, Christian.
This might be too much weeds question, but for the vote example,
Yeah.
what would happen? That's historically some examples. But what happened in the case of a bad transaction where, let's say, that the vote maker makes a vote,
Yeah.
it's like half a year's worth of catch,
Yeah.
and then the vote falls apart or saying
Yeah.
it's supporting it.
So this is like an information asymmetry problem, right? If we're thinking about sort of what happens in a market economy, you sign a contract, right? If you buy a car and the dealership says, hey, once you drive off the lot, it's your problem. You drive off the lot and then you start hearing like a choke, 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 right? Like there's smoke coming out of the engine. You just say, oh, that sucks for me, right? I shouldn't have trusted those people. Maybe you leave a bad Yelp review, right? What happens if your boat maker like doesn't properly put tar on the boat so that it falls apart in the water? What happens is like you talk shit about them, right? You tell everyone what an asshole they are and what a bad boat they made, and everyone gets mad at them. They show up in a big crowd in front of their house, and they're like, "Why would you do this guy? Like, we thought we trusted you. We thought you were decent at your job. You suck. Your kids are never getting married. You're not invited to our parties. This is and then the boat maker would be like, ah, that's terrible, right? I've made a bad decision, and either would have the power to tell everyone, well, screw you, I'm the only boat maker, or not." Right? So essentially the idea is, how do we deal with those problems? We deal with those problems through social pressure, through social norms, right? Through the fact that people who deviate too far from what their society expects of them get punished by their society. So I don't know, if you ever, if you miss high school because it was so fun to have people, bully you for not doing the right thing. Like, this is a system that's built entirely on that. Yeah.
But so this is just relying on societies being small and economies
Yeah.
being super small, which then just means we can't have
Like, how do you have an
complex
anarchist
economy.
airplane?
Yeah, exactly. We can't have a complex economy. We can't have good stuff. A small group of people is never gonna create an iPhone.
So
super small-
it's a
that
really
small
good
group.
question. If we think about sort of what you can do through discussion, consensus, social norms,
Yeah.
right? And you ask, well, could you run a company with 50,000 employees on consensus and social norms? Or not a company, right? Can you run an organized social process to create something with 50,000 people off of social norms? Certainly, if we think about, what are the historical pre-state examples, we can't go to the Bronze Age and look in the Tulberg forest and find German tribes that made iPhones and airplanes and be like, damn, they did a really good job with these complex processes, right? The argument that I think someone who's more optimistic about the system would make, right, for why you could get, well, I guess there's two arguments. One would be to say, yeah, that's true, right? You can't have the same level of organizational complexity under the system, and that's just a cost, right? You get some good things and you lose some good things, and such is life. Another argument would be to say that we've spent about 400 years now figuring out how to use price signals to get people to do highly complex organized tasks. If you look at what a capitalist market economy looked like in 1700, the biggest companies were really small, right? The biggest companies were 4 extended families hanging out in a shack together, right? Counting their coins and telling people what to do. It's a little, but we've built these increasingly complex, sophisticated tools, joint stock companies, right? Complex contracting systems, etc., warranties, payment systems to allow these big companies to exist. So if we think about what would a communal organization, what would a communally organized society look like in 400 years, right? Could we come up with ways of using consensus to build our way up to building an airplane? I don't know. I mean, maybe, right? It's hard for me to make an argument for what definitely can't happen in 400 years.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions about Anarcho-Socialism? And hello to the new people. I'm Professor Harris, if you haven't met me before, which I don't think you have. It's nice to see you. Yeah.
But wouldn't the market be more efficient than social pressure in terms of reputational cost, or why do you need small scale communities to enforce companies?
So you're thinking if we think about big company, if we think about our actual world that we live in now, and we say what would happen to McDonald's if they just ground up rats in their meat? Right? One person makes a TikTok video and they're like, McDonald's is grounding up rats in their meat. And because they're a giant multinational corporation, they would lose a ton of money overnight. And, right, we would have information travel very quickly and hurt them badly. That's what you're thinking, right? Yeah, so we have a bunch of tools for solving these problems, right? If we think about information asymmetry, branding is an incredibly powerful tool for solving this problem, right? So are a lot of legal remedies. I think the question, if you ask sort of, We talked before about sort of the miracle of decentralized decision making through markets and competition versus these problems. If you think of these as essentially the exceptions to the rule of markets functioning well, then why on earth would you throw the baby out with the bathwater? Right? You would say, well, we should let markets do their thing. We should ride the tiger, right? Experience the magic, and then we try to fix these problems. And some of these problems can be fixed through government action or collective action, and some of these problems are just going to be fixed through market, right? Consumer Reports is a private company that tells you whether your light bulb is made by a company that knows what they're doing when they make light bulbs. This make sense?
Yeah.
I think if you ask the question, though, what kind of information asymmetries do we struggle with? A few years ago, I put some work into trying to figure out how to buy clothing that I knew wasn't made with slave labor in Xinjiang, which I'm not pronouncing correctly, right? There was a bunch of reports about, cotton, people being forced into cotton fields. It was very horrifying, and I thought, well, I'd feel pretty bad if I was wearing a t-shirt that was made by slave labor. And if you try to figure out, like, where was my t-shirt made? Or where's the cotton for my t-shirt made? It is basically impossible to figure out, right? The companies don't know where the cotton comes from, right? Because they're buying from distributors who buy from suppliers, right? There's this like very, very complex supply chain. They don't look more than 3 levels back, right? If you don't care about that, there's a million other examples of this where getting information can be quite difficult, right? If you ask questions like, there's recently a big frou-frou, which I didn't read about, so I don't know how big a deal it is, but like lead in protein powder, right? Does your protein powder contain lead? Definitely this is something where if there's a big news report that says this particular company has protein powder with lead in it, people might freak out about it. But it's not a terribly efficient system for you to know exactly what you're putting in your body, right? If you think about, well, what are the costs to you? If I was the CEO of, I don't know, Lead Protein Corporation, I might care a little more, right? I might care about sort of my stock price dropping because someone finds out that there was lead in protein powder. I might care even more about my neighbor's kid getting sick and realizing I put lead in the protein powder and then having them hate me forever, right? That might be a bigger deal for me. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
It's a really good question. Other questions on this, and obviously we're now like an hour and a half in, or an hour in, so we're an hour and a half, and we've done one of our 3. So I'll keep going until you guys get sick of me, right? But yeah. Other questions about anarcho-socialism? Yeah.
Where does money fit into this like society? Because if I'm trading for fish,
Yeah.
as we like keep trading more and more, eventually some kind of commodity is going to act like money. To
Probably.
a point, right?
Yeah.
And then doesn't that kind of like make like allow us to not be as connected?
So when you look at the way a lot of sort of communal societies operate, things that operate as money often actually don't come until you have lots of trade between different communities. Even like, I mean, forget about like, talking about, I don't know, the interior of Africa or something. Like, if you talk about like small town America, I have a friend who's a large animal vet in upstate New York. She gets paid a lot in like vegetables and meat, right? She'll go do a favor for someone and they'll say, "Oh, that's so nice. Like, here, take some kohlrabi and cabbage," right? And one of the you're right. One of the consequences of sort of like I go and check out your cow and I see that your cow is okay, and then I don't charge you, and then the next day like a bushel of vegetables shows up on my doorstep, is now we both feel quite nice about each other. And also that's a system that's less legible. So it's harder for you to figure out whether the vet in the next town is giving you a better or worse deal in your vegetables for veterinary attention trade. So the reason I think money doesn't often emerge in small scale economies is a combination of what you're talking about, right? That money is sort of too explicit, plus that it's not necessary, because when people have an intuitive sense of what different things are worth, they don't necessarily need to denominate things. That said, and again, you're not talking to someone who's actually an anarchist, right? So like, I don't actually know the answer to all these things. But if you ask the question, does money immediately destroy the system? I would say no, right? The question of sort of how does this work really comes down to the idea that individual communities figure out their own ways to make things work. Some communities might find things like money to be quite helpful. Others might not find things like money to be quite helpful, right? The communities that find a set of rules that work are going to draw in new members. They're going to be imitated by other people, and those things are going to spread. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So great question. Other questions about this? Should we talk about anarcho-capitalism? All right, let's talk. Yeah.
Something a little less dated than this.
All right. Oh, one thing in terms of data, by the way, I meant to say sort of like what are some impacts in the real world of these ideas. So, I mean, this is not the only thing. There have been a bunch of attempts to create anarchist societies. The Paris Commune was a famous one. Another one in the sort of the communist revolution in the USSR. The two big factions were the Bolsheviks and the Soviet revolutionaries, or the SRs. The SRs had way more people than the Bolsheviks and just like weren't in Moscow at the right time. But they were basically anarchists, anarcho-socialists. Their idea was the way that Tsarist Russia worked, it's an aside, but whatever. You're stuck with me.
No, this is good for the person we're going to show this recording to.
Oh, good. Okay. So the way that Tsarist Russia worked, this is the way that actually a lot of sort of feudal systems worked, is that taxes were not imposed on people, taxes were imposed on communities. So, you would have a village, the village would owe tax, and the village would have to decide basically how to collect that tax. So what it meant in practice is that villages made all these communal decisions about who farmed what land and who owed what to who, right? Collected the taxes from themselves, and what the sort of Tsarist state did was just like extract from the top. So the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, essentially said, if we just like kill the Tsar, then we have anarchism, right? We have a bunch of self-governing communities that just don't have to pay taxes to a Tsar. That'd be cool, right? Maybe they can pay a little tax to like some army to keep the capitalists from invading us, but that's it. So that was probably the closest, one of the most sort of major moves towards actually creating this. Also in Ukraine during this period, there was a large anarchist movement, and then, Lenin just killed all of them. So, such is life. Okay, so anarcho-capitalism.
Wait, so the Bolsheviks then turned against it?
So the Bolsheviks were always a Marxist.
Yeah.
So Lenin and the sort of the Russian Social Democratic Party, which turned into the Bolsheviks.
Uh-huh.
Well, the Bolsheviks were one faction of any. They were allies with the SRs during the fight against the Tsar. Once they beat the Tsar, I mean, the USSR was named after the Soviet republics created by the SRs. So they created sort of a hybrid state after they beat the Tsar, where they shared power, and then Lenin kind of seized power from the SRs.
So there were like two revolutions.
Yeah, there were like so many revolutions. Yeah. This is what tends to happen in revolutions. It's like, we all agree that this guy's got to go, and then once that guy goes, then we got to figure out what to do next. So, okay, so this is sort of the idea behind anarcho-socialism. If we think about sort of neoliberalism as saying we're going to have decentralized competition, right, is the basic engine of the economy, and then we're going to have collective action to regulate it, right? Collective action to solve these problems. If we think about anarcho-socialism as being right, anarcho-socialism as being we're going to have decentralized cooperation, right? We're going to have a bunch of decentralized communities that are collectively going to solve problems through communal discussion, right? And then kind of compete with each other for members or compete with each other to be an effective way of living life. We can think about anarcho-capitalism as essentially being decentralized competition for the engine of society, right? Agreeing with neoliberals about the basic question of like, how do we decide how to make a pencil? But also decentralized competition when it comes to solving the problems with markets, right? So the idea with anarcho-capitalism is we don't actually need a central government to step in and regulate externalities, regulate information asymmetries, break up monopolies, deal with inequality, right? We can have those functions also be essentially performed by private companies, by individuals pursuing their own self-interest, right, through sort of emergent structures that come out of markets. This make sense as a basic framework? Okay. So in terms of like where this comes from, so anarcho-capitalism kind of comes out of Karl Hess and Murray Rothbard in the mid to early 20th century. There have not been states that have been governed on anarcho-capitalist principles. A historical example that sometimes gets used that I'll talk about a little bit is Iceland, which didn't have a king, right? It was a very decentralized system where people pursued their economic self-interest to a great degree. Also, the sort of contemporary place where it's closest to this is there's this idea of charter cities. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. The idea essentially being that you can take plots of land, have them not governed by any particular government, right, or sort of exempted from the normal laws of governments, and have them run on sort of a contractual basis. So the government of Honduras allowed charter cities for a while, now they're trying to pull them back. There's a couple of sort of experimental, the biggest is probably called Prospera, I think, experimental societies in Honduras that are trying to run on these plots. Okay, so the idea is essentially that we can use markets to solve these problems as well, right? So I want to talk a little bit about how that's supposed to work. So if we think about, let's start by thinking about externalities. Let's, I don't know, stick with boats for some reason, right? Let's imagine that, we all live on a lake, right? You've got fisher people who like to fish in the lake, and we have our boat builder. The boat builder can make their boats by dumping their leftover tar in the lake and killing some fish, or they can like safely dispose of the tar in a way that's more expensive to them. This make sense? If we think about sort of what does the neoliberal argument expect to have happen, it would say that, well, absent some sort of government intervention, of course, the boat builder is going to dump the tar in the lake, right? Because that's going to be cheaper for them. They're not going to, in the prices that they face for the goods that they're buying, the prices they sell stuff at, they're not going to have to price in the consequences of that decision for other people. Does this make sense? The anarcho-capitalist argument is to say, well, let's start by asking a question: who owns the lake? Does this make sense? So let's say that the boat builder owns the lake. Well, what do we do? What would happen if the boat builder owns the lake? I'm the boat builder, I'm dumping tar in the lake. You guys are all trying to fish in my lake. Tar's killing your fish. What are you going to do about it? We're not in anarchism, so you can't beat me up, right?
Don't buy boats.
Yeah, you could maybe boycott me. Another thing you could do, you could bribe me, right? You guys could all get together. You could create like the Lake Cleanliness Corporation, right? Collect something from all of your members, right? Negotiate amongst yourself who's going to pay what, and then come to me with an offer and say, hey, listen, like if you just stop dumping tar in this lake, we'll give you $50 a month. And if I say, oh, that's great because dumping tar in the lake only saves me $40 a month, I'll just stop. Does this make sense? So what we can do is if the boat builder owns the lake, the fisher people and pay the boat builder. And let's say you guys all get together, you say, hey, we'll pay you $50 a month to not dump tar in the lake. And I say, oh, well, it saves me $60 a month to not dump tar in the lake. Then the conclusion we may draw is, it's actually better for me to dump the tar in the lake. It only costs you guys $50, it saves me $60. It sounds like a pretty good deal, right? We should all be dumping tar in lakes. Does this make sense? Okay, so this is what happens if the boat builder owns the lake. What if the fisher people own the lake? Right? Let's say that there's some joint cooperative tenant agreement where, the lake is collectively owned by 100 people, right? You all have an easement on the lake. And I'm dumping tar in the lake. What can you do? Yeah.
You can charge, you say you can't do that, and if you want to do it, you have to pay us.
Yeah, you can charge for dumping, right? Again, if I can offer a price that the Fisher People's Corporation is willing to take to dump in the lake, then great, we're done. Does this make sense? Okay, great. So this is something called the Coase theorem. The idea of the Coase theorem is that anytime you have an externality, we typically think the externality is like somebody is doing something bad, right, that causes problems for other people, or someone's doing something good that's causing benefits for other people. We don't worry as much about that. Someone's doing something bad that causes problems for other people, and we have to do something to control the bad person's behavior, right, or price in their behavior. The Coase theorem essentially says, well, actually, it takes two to create an externality, right? In order for the tar in the lake thing to be a problem, there's got to be people who are hurt by the tar in the lake thing. So now we kind of got an issue between these two people. We should let them work it out. And essentially, the idea with the Coase theorem is whoever you allocate property rights to or resource rights to, if negotiating is sufficiently low cost, actually if it's zero cost, which is not, right? But if negotiating was zero cost, then you can have these two people come to their own arrangement that's going to be economically efficient. This make sense? Okay. So that's sort of a way that we might deal with externalities. Then we think about, well, what about information asymmetry? Right? How am I going to deal with you make me a boat, the boat looks beautiful, I'm not a boat expert, I think, oh, this looks great. Turns out once I get in the water, the tar starts eroding because you didn't use the right kind of tar, and the whole boat falls apart and I drown. Right? That would suck. Information problems. How might we deal with this? Without the market, without the government intervening. Yeah.
Like private assurance agencies.
Yeah. So say more. Explain.
If there are corporations that would vouch for certain goods and maintain
Exactly.
their reputation that were private.
Yeah. So I mentioned before that we're buying a used car that we're killing children to get, and we're getting it through Carvana, which is basically this, right? You sell them your used car. They send some person to do like an inspection to say that the car isn't terrible, and then they sell it to someone else, right? And then there's a brand name Carvana that if you get the car and it's a piece of junk, like the big brand, has a problem rather than just like Sophia Field's no longer being trusted as a seller of used cars. You don't care because you only had one in the first place, right? We can have basically an inspector come look at the product to make sure it's good. You know, consumer reports, right? People who are going to charge companies money in order to certify that the company's products are high quality. You can also have companies offer warranties, right? I could say to you, okay, I'm going to sell you this boat, and if the boat falls apart, in less than 10 years, then I'm going to have to pay to repair it, or I'm going to have to pay to replace it. Does this make sense? These can be private contracts. And these private contracts have advantages over, a law requiring certain information disclosures or a law requiring certain quality standards, because maybe you care a lot about your boat lasting for 10 years, whereas Alyssa just wants to like show off to her friends one day on a boat, just be like, hey, look at me, I've got a fishing boat, and doesn't care if it falls apart after that, so you can buy from the junk boat people, right? Okay. And how about market power? So there's an argument that comes from an economist named Schopenhauer, I'm forgetting his first name, that essentially, if you think about the fundamental market power argument, we've got, let's think about a monopolist, right? It's going to set a monopoly price, right? Produce too little output, right? Create a socially inefficient outcome. When we think about, well, what are our options for regulation and what happens if we don't regulate? Well, one thing, if we don't regulate at all, that those of you who took 250 with me definitely know, right, is that there's a lot of options available to the monopolists themselves to capture more surplus in a way that it makes the overall economy more efficient, right? They can do things like charge two-part tariffs, right? Charge an access fee and then charge a marginal cost per unit. They can charge different prices to different people, right? Price discriminate in order to be able to sell additional units to people with lower willingness to pay. On top of that, when we have a monopolist engaging in even traditional monopoly pricing, the consequence is that the monopolist makes a bunch of money, right? The monopolist makes a bunch of money beyond what they would make otherwise. And the argument then is, some company making a ton of money because they're the only person producing a piece of output is like a giant bat signal to competitors to come in and figure out some better product to produce, right? It's attractive to competition. If instead, we had something like a government regulation of prices, by the way, right, we could have competition enter that's not actually as efficient as our monopolist, right? We could have a competition enter that had a marginal cost like this, right? And because their marginal cost is lower than the monopolist cost, they can still put pressure on the monopolist lower prices, right? If instead we have the government regulate prices to be at the efficient level, even if we thought such a thing was possible, right? One of the things that's going to do is it's going to reduce the incentive for other companies to come in and try to compete with the monopolist, right? Particularly companies that initially have higher marginal costs because they don't have as much experience, they don't have the same scale, etc. This make sense? Yeah. Beautiful. So, okay, these are the easy arguments for anarcho-capitalism. The hard argument is, so we said, all right, well, if the fisher people on the lake and the boat guy is dumping tar in the boat, then they can just charge him for dumping. Obvious counterpoint to this is, what if the boat guy says, fuck you, I don't want to pay you for dumping in your lake. What are you going to do about it? What happens then, right? Do we just have to fight each other? And if we just have to fight each other, then, this isn't really anarcho-capitalism, this is just anarcho-militarism or something, right? So, an argument you can have here, right? How do we actually have enforceable contracts? How do you actually have people follow laws, right, in a system that doesn't have some overriding government authority forcing people to do that? So some people who are associated with, anarcho-capitalist thinking, like Friedrich Hayek, who wasn't an anarcho-capitalist, right, would say, well, yeah, obviously just have a government. The government deals with it. Other people would say, well, you don't need to have a government. What you can have is private sector legal agencies that provide a set of laws, right? Say, okay, well, if you're going to sign on to, Doc J's, spick and spam legal code, then you're going to not be allowed to murder people, right? You're not going to be allowed, you're going to have to follow this set of rules, and we're going to certify contracts, and we're going to be responsible for adjudicating on contracts. Then what we might do is, if you have a dispute with someone who's following the same legal code as you, right? You take that to the adjudicator. The adjudicator gives a decision. If the adjudicator rules against you, then all these private sector enforcers are going to be able to come enforce the law on you, which might be kind of ugly, right? Without running afoul of the adjudicator. Does this make sense? So essentially we say this, Sophia dumps tar in the lake, she didn't pay for it, she's now fair game, anyone can go beat her up and take her stuff, and it's completely kosher, it's completely fine, right? We can have one legal code that everyone follows. We can also have a couple different legal codes that have some sort of relationship with each other. So, okay, this sounds kind of ridiculous. Like, how does this work, right? Why does anyone care what the judge says if the judge isn't connected to the people who show up and beat you up and take all your stuff? A way that, this worked, this is basically how Iceland worked, pre-Christianity. Iceland was divided among a couple hundred, like, powerful families. They had a code of laws that everyone understood, and they had a judicial process. So let's say that Milo and I get in a dispute, right? I kill one of your pigs and I don't pay you for it. We would go to Sophia, the judge, and we would say, listen, I killed his pig. His pig was on my land, right? I didn't pay him for it because I told him his pig was coming on my land and he didn't do anything about it. You would decide who's in the right and who's in the wrong. You would issue a penalty. If Milo was, let's say fined, $100 and refused to pay, you would then declare Milo an outlaw. And all the rest of you, the other 198 families, would then know that you could kill Milo and take his stuff and not be in trouble with anybody. Does this make sense? So it's a game theory problem, right? If I think that everyone else is going to follow the rule that you are going to get in trouble for killing someone if they don't have a judicial writ against them, but not if they do, then none of us are going to want to do anything that the judge says we can't do, right? We had this decentralized system work in Iceland for hundreds of years without any sort of central authority. People mostly know how it works from reading the Icelandic sagas, which are like 100% about people killing each other. So you'd think like, okay, well, this isn't great, right? This isn't a very functional system. When people have actually tried to count the number of people who died in the Icelandic sagas and figure out what the murder rate was on the basis of this, it seems like it's lower than the murder rate in like mainland Scandinavia that had kings. So I don't know. Neither of these are fantastic systems. I would not want to go to either of them, but potentially an argument for why this sort of decentralized legal code could potentially work. The last thing, well, how does this deal with inequality? It's kind of up to people. There's a couple kinds of inequality that matter, right? One is we can think about stuff like social insurance, right? You can have inequality that comes from, well, what if something terrible happens to me, right? And I end up in a really bad situation. Well, potentially you can have private sector insurance, just like we do now, right? What if my house burns down? Well, I can buy insurance that's going to pay me back for the house that I lose. What if I die prematurely and my children are left orphans? Well, I can buy life insurance. There's other kinds of inequality that are really difficult to deal with this way, right? If we ask about what's the inequality between me and those children in Nigeria, right, whose lives can be saved for $3,000 of anti-malarial treatments, there's really not a lot they can sell me, right, that's going to help deal with this inequality. This is pretty fundamental. So how do we deal with that sort of inequality? Ultimately, it comes down to how we feel about ourselves and our obligations to other people, just like it does now. Instead of saying people are going to vote on how high the taxes should be for everyone in order to resolve inequality, we would have to count on people to actually do stuff with their own money to help other people. Does this make sense? Okay. Questions about anarcho-capitalism? Yeah.
Oh, really flawed.
Yeah.
In like anarcho-capitalism, there's like the quote, like the adjudicator of like
Yeah.
the system. What if they were prone to being like bribed?
So, this is a great question. Yeah, so what if Sophia is terrible at this, right?
Yeah.
So the answer there would be that there isn't an adjudicator. There's a number of adjudicators. There might be a law code, right, that we've all agreed on, or a couple of law codes. And then in order to, when you and I sign a contract, right, I'm going to buy your boat, and you tell me, dude, I caulked this boat perfectly. It's going to last forever. And we get this extended warranty or whatever. We might have to agree together. Are we going to choose Sophia as the mediator if we have a dispute? Are we going to choose Reggie? Or are we going to choose Milo? Right? If Sophia is known to everyone to be a crook and a scumbag, right? And Reggie is known to fall asleep during the hearings and not pay any attention and also be illiterate, then we're just going to choose Milo, right? And if we're not both happy with the adjudicator, then we're not going to make a deal. So, essentially the idea is everything is done through competition, right? What if the law code is bad? Well, then an alternative law code is going to compete with it, and we'll go with the alternative law code. If the adjudicator is bad, then we choose a different adjudicator. If the enforcement team is bad, right, we hire a different enforcement team to go beat up the first enforcement team. Does this make sense? It's a great question. Other questions about this system? Yeah.
Won't private militaries just kind of dominate everything?
So this is eventually what happened to Iceland.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, right, the question is basically, okay, we say we've got 200 people, right? Every one of us knows there's a collective action problem. If someone goes against the ruling of the court, then everyone knows that person's fair game. No one person is as strong as the other 199 people, so everyone has an incentive to stay within the bounds of the law, right? The obvious problem with this is, well, what if there's just some super powerful, right,
I don't know, what if I show up there and I'm like, dude, I can take all of you, right? Bring it, 199 Icelandic Vikings, right? I can just terrorize everyone and become powerful overlord over everything. Or what if a group of us get together and we decide we don't want to share with other people? We're going to dominate society, right? What's going to stop us from doing that, right? In Iceland, this is a kind of a mixed story, right? Some of this is also the spread of Christianity kind of weakened the original system, because it like the original system was based on a set of shared norms that came from a like shared Viking tradition, and some of it was also like everyone else had a king, so it was becoming increasingly weird not to have a king. So like a king showed up, I think, from Norway. It's like, you guys should really make me your king. And they did. So yeah, the question of how does this whole system get overthrown by a cabal of powerful people is a really important problem. I would note that's also a problem here now, right? I mean, the question is sort of like, why doesn't, I don't know, like the military or the president just declare that they're in charge now and no one can do anything about it? We're not having any more elections. Like that's a live question, right? The answer to this essentially comes down to how widely distributed is power, right? If power is sufficiently widely distributed, then it's difficult for that to happen. But yeah, it's a very fair question. Other questions? Yeah.
Like what happens if, like, let's say, like war is profitable. So
Yeah.
there's companies making money from the weapons being produced,
Mm-hmm.
and then those people are paying like all 200 of the judicial powers.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, like, war is profitable for pretty much everybody except for people getting killed. Like, is there any
Yeah.
solution for that?
So this is a really interesting question because I would argue war is unprofitable for pretty much everyone except for the small number of people who profit. The reason that we probably, hopefully all agree that war is generally to be avoided is because it's quite destructive, right? People get killed and things get destroyed. So if we think about sort of what's the total size of the pie that there is to distribute among people, war definitely shrinks the size of that pie. The reason people still go to war is because they can get a bigger piece of the pie, right? That makes up for the fact that the total pie is shrinking. So that's not an answer to your question, right? Your question is essentially asking if we have social hierarchy, right? So we have some number of people who are designated as judges, some number of people who are designated as enforcers, etc. What's stopping all of those members of the social hierarchy from essentially either banding together themselves or being co-opted by someone who wants to seize a bigger piece of the pie for themselves? That's basically your question, right?
And also, like, well, what if the war is foreign, right? You know, it's 3,000
Sure.
miles away. So
Oh, yeah.
that faces devastation.
Okay, well, so for that question, the answer is like, yeah, 100% that'll happen. So, I was talking about Iceland as an example, right? The Vikings in general are a big example of this. The kings of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden come well after sort of the peak of the Viking era when the Vikings were their most powerful and most extensive. And essentially what the Viking era looked like was like a bunch of decentralized people getting together and being like, hey, there was this whole concept of, what were they called, like shore kings or something, right? I would show up and be like, I'm King Jorgen the Great, right? Like, I'm going to go sack Paris, I'm going to get a bunch of slaves, I'm going to get a bunch of money, it's going to be awesome. Like, I'll give 1% of my revenues to anyone who brings a ship with me, right? And we all sign contracts and we create this like nice joint stock corporation together and we go sack Paris and kill a bunch of people and pillage and have a great time and come back and make a bunch of money. That's exactly how it worked. It was great. Everyone got rich. Obviously except for the people in Paris, right? They didn't. So yeah, people outside of the system, right, are not going to benefit. The argument you could make, right, for sort of how do you solve this problem is the reason that Viking raiders were going and sacking Paris, England, etc. is because there was good stuff to take, right? So if you have a system of contract, potentially what you do is you say, all right, well, they can pay to not get sacked, right? And because there's no sort of rule saying violence is off the table, right? That's a legitimate service to pay for. Or this is again what actually happened. They can pay the biggest and baddest group of Vikings they can find to protect them from the other Vikings, right? And this happened a lot. Sometimes the Vikings they paid would just sack them, but a lot of times they actually did their jobs. The other counter would be if you ask the question: does this system sort of make sure that a society acts justly to the societies around it? The answer is like for sure it doesn't. Right? But that's a very hard problem to solve in general. Right? That's a problem that I don't think any social organization or economic organization has convincingly solved. The main way we solve that problem is either bring everyone into the same social organization or like having ethical codes.
Yeah.
Right?
The main way I would say this is maybe worse than some alternatives is because it's so decentralized. You could have 95% of people think it's terrible to go invade Panama and take all their stuff, and if the 5% who think it would be really fun, like are strong enough to go invade Panama, they'll just do it, and no one can tell them not to. So yeah, it's a very fair question. Other questions? Yeah,
On the issue of competition,
yeah,
my biggest, critique I feel like is that these just massive monopolies form, and if we look at what like Rockefeller did with
Yeah.
Standard Oil, he has such a monopoly that anytime competition tried to come in, he could just lower prices and like run at a loss, drive them out of business, then he jack them back up again. And I feel like, without the government antitrust stuff like that can just happen, like all the large corporations we have now. And like, is there any guarantee that we get to some sort of more efficient outcome, or do the anarcho-capitalists, should they go, we're kind of just screwed with a monopoly and extremely high prices? And
So it's a very fair question. And there's a couple components to the answer. If you think about what was Standard Oil able to do that allowed them to have the kind of monopoly power that they have? It's a combination of things. One thing happening is returns to scale, right? Is essentially that they could actually operate more efficiently than other oil companies because they had scale to have the kind of infrastructure that makes them more efficient. If we talk about Marxism, we'll talk about this, right? The other thing is, as you're talking about, essentially, if you buy up enough of the key resource, then a competitor just doesn't have the ability to break in and disrupt you. The general argument, so there's an anarcho-capitalist argument for why we shouldn't be worried about this, but you might not find it totally convincing, right? One argument here is that monopolizing one key resource increases the value of someone finding an alternative key resource. So if we think about another classic example of this sort of monopolizing key resource is the De Beers Diamond Corporation, right, that bought up all of the diamond mines in Southern Africa, or almost all of the diamond mines in Southern Africa, and then bought up a lot of diamond mines around the world. Controlled the price of diamonds for, I think, about 80 years. Their monopoly fell apart largely because people went and found diamonds in Canada that weren't owned by De Beers, and competing companies could operate at much higher marginal cost than De Beers and still undercut their prices because De Beers was charging such high monopoly prices. We also eventually figured out how to make lab diamonds, right? Lab diamonds are still more expensive than mined diamonds for the most part, but those costs are falling as the technology is getting better. To some degree, the presence of De Beers creates an incentive to create those alternatives. So that's sort of one answer, is that someone with a monopoly in one place can't necessarily protect that monopoly all the time. The fact that they're charging a high monopoly price creates an incentive for people to figure out a way around the monopoly. The issue with this is, and my understanding of what you're saying, is kind of gets to the same question of, well, why don't we just bribe all the judges to let us be in charge of everything? If you don't have sufficiently decentralized power to begin with, then you can't have a system that keeps everyone in check by the fact that they have to deal with everybody else, right? So if you have sufficient monopoly power to start with, that monopoly power isn't going to go anywhere, right? If we started out with someone owning everything on Earth, well, that person's just going to be in charge of everything. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a very fair question. The other sort of argument, especially you see this from Milton Friedman, who again was not an anarcho-capitalist, right? Is that a lot of times we talk about this, we say, well, will the market solve this problem? We don't ask the question enough, well, does regulation solve the problem? So the issue is sort of like, do you just bribe the judges and get out of these contracts? If we look at actual anti-monopoly regulation, a lot of times what happens is you just bribe the regulators. And it's even easier to bribe a regulator than it is to bribe all of the decentralized judges. So, another potential argument is, yes, this is a problem, but it's not a problem that's necessarily solved worse here than it is in other systems. Other questions about anarchy? Yeah.
So, is the Austrian school essentially like an offshoot of this? Like, it takes a lot of the ideas about deregulated markets and
yeah,
the power of price signals and all that. But then it's just, if you have the government to enforce private property rights.
Yeah.
That's just the difference there.
I would actually say this is an offshoot of the Austrian school. So the Austrian school, if you think about Friedrich Hayek especially, Friedrich Hayek was his key theories were around this sort of decentralized information sharing we were talking about before, right? The power of prices to convey information across space. But in his sort of political theory, at least as I understand it, he wrote a lot of stuff and I've only read a tiny bit of it, right? But my understanding of his political theory, he was not saying we should eliminate the government. And in fact, Hayek was a proponent of universal income to try to deal with inequality, right? He didn't think that markets solve everything. He thought markets solve allocation problems really well, right? And pricing problems really well. So anarcho-capitalist ideas essentially take an Austrian understanding of how the economy works and wed them to political theory that comes out of anarchist and libertarian ideas, right? And historical analysis that looks at stuff like how the, Icelandic societies work, etc. How a lot of societies operate without the use of formal law or government power. Yeah, it's a great question. So just like, we're talking about like Polanyi and James C. Scott when I was talking about anarchists, and neither of them were really anarchists, right? A lot of this is sort of an offshoot of Friedrich Hayek's ideas, even though Friedrich Hayek wasn't an anarcho-capitalist. Other questions? Yeah.
How does inequality not just become a huge problem? Because you kind of said that you have to kind of like rely on the fact that people kind of want to.
So yeah, you need to rely on one of two, or two things together, right? One thing is you need to rely on people having a sense of solidarity with each other and being willing to like take costly efforts to help other people. Sorry to editorialize as I'm explaining it, right? In my opinion, if we talk about things like, for example, malaria deaths in Nigeria, my hope is that all of us in this room feel pretty bad about that. And also, and like, we donate a good amount to this, right? But there's a certain point where like, I could live in my car and I wouldn't solve the problem of malaria deaths in Nigeria, right? So there's a little bit of a collective action problem. I don't actually get to feel good about this unless everybody donates enough money to actually solve it, right? If I try to solve it by myself, it's a drop in the bucket. So the argument against saying that we can sort of rely on individual charity is that, right? That the existence of poverty is a collective problem, and we as individuals aren't sort of going to take individual action to solve public goods problem. The other piece of the argument that would sort of that I find more compelling for how this is not going to lead to runaway inequality is the other thing that prevents inequality from getting really large is for the productive capacity of basically the ownership of productive resources to be reasonably evenly distributed. In our economy now, 2/3 to 3/4, depending on the accounting that you do, of output in the economy is paid to workers, right? Labor is by far the most valuable productive input in the economy. Most of the reason for inequality, both nationally and globally, is because different people's labor is worth very different amounts, right? Or is paid very different amounts. A lot of the reason that different people's labor is paid very different amounts is because of, arguably, is because of barriers to trade. So one way that we can stop children from dying of malaria in northern Nigeria is for us in the United States to donate money to buy bed nets and preventative medicine and malaria vaccines, which we should totally do. Like, one lesson is you guys should go make money and donate some of it to vaccines. That'd be great, right? Another thing we could potentially do is just let people move from Nigeria here, right? And make money here and then send some money to their families. I think I'm going to get the exact number wrong, but I think when people have calculated sort of how much more can the same person earn in the United States versus Nigeria, it's like 32 times as much, right? So a big part of global inequality is that we have legal barriers to stop people from trading with each other. If you also ask, why is it that barriers to, access to education is such a problem? Well, it's not actually legal right now for me to make a contract with you where I say, hey, I'll pay for you to go to college and you have to give me 2% of your earnings for the rest of your life. Right? Potentially, if we allowed more freedom of contract, it would be easier for people to make productive investments in themselves and their families. So sort of the other argument for sort of why is it that this wouldn't lead to runaway inequality would be to say a lot of inequality is actually government enforced, right? It's us not allowing certain kinds of trade that would benefit the people who are currently most marginalized in our society. Is that correct? Yeah.
I don't know, like, at what point you're just reinventing the government here. Like, this would, like, move away from, like, capitalism, some other capitalism. But I guess you could have a system where, like, people join guilds.
Yeah.
And then, like, you refuse to do business with a company that doesn't give, like, 20% of their profits.
Yeah. I mean, this is basically, this is what the welfare state was in the United States before there was a welfare state. And still is actually what the welfare state is, to a large degree in the United States, right? Is that people have formed not necessarily guilds that control prices, but they joined various sorts of associations that provided things like life insurance and health insurance through exactly this sort of platform. And they preferentially did business with people within their associations. Part of the reason that we still in the United States, employer provided health insurance is such a major part of how we do healthcare, and employer provided retirement savings are such a big part of how we do retirement savings, et cetera, is that a lot of that social safety net developed in the United States before this was something that governments regularly did. In Europe, there was less of that sort of prior to the 20th century. So, when you're starting from scratch, the government took those roles. So yeah, I think, and a lot of times the question with anarchism and anarcho-capitalism is, at what point have you just invented a government again? Right? The argument would be that you form these associations freely, and you can leave them freely, and there's contracts that are clearly specified. Again, the problem with this, right, is that I only want to form an association with you where we're going to both pay 20% towards some collective good if, like, you and I have similar resources. Right? It's not going to help me very much to form like a social insurance guild between me and a bunch of subsistence farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. Right? Because like it's 100% going to be like them and not me who have the health problem that needs help. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess the idea
Yeah.
would be altruistically.
Yeah, I mean, that would be awesome.
And then, like, you wouldn't, do business with really rich people that don't.
Yeah,
that
and
don't.
again, this is something we kind of see people do, right? We see corporations take these sorts of, environmental sustainable pledges. We see, I think Vanguard has said that they won't do business, right? Won't invest in companies that don't meet certain ESG goals. So absolutely, that's something we could do to try to accomplish altruistic goals that have a public goods problem associated with them. Absolutely. Yeah.
A lot of the structure seems to be held up by, like all these legalistic contracts and adjudicators
Yeah.
and stuff. And, one of the, big complaints about government is that, like, oh, there's always so much regulation, so much
Yeah.
red tape. What are your thoughts on, like, the idea that under this anarcho-capitalist system, there's actually so many contracts that you need to sign and agreements and adjudicators that, like, there's even more, or
Yeah.
like just as much regulation? It's actually still very inefficient.
I think that's a very fair critique. And this kind of goes back to this, like, are we just reinventing the government but calling it like a corporation, right? You just call the United States like the America Corporation with stocks shared equally across people, and we have shareholder meetings once every 4 years where we elect the president of the board. Like, oh my goodness, like what an amazing new system. So yeah, I mean, if you ask a question like, for example, with information asymmetry, right? Do I want to sign a contract at the grocery store that says if I get sick from eating this apple, right, you owe me X dollars, or I'm gonna sign that I saw the certification agency that said that your apple is okay. Why don't I just have the FDA look at the apple, right? Why don't I just have the government do it? I think the question of, so on the one hand, I think what you can say there is, because there's competition between contractual arrangements and legal codes, if one legal code is just incredibly bureaucratic and onerous, we just won't use it. We'll use a different legal code that's easier and more comfortable for our lives, right? And matches the level of regulation that I personally want. So you might shop, if you're a hypochondriac, you might shop at the store that, has disclosures on every apple. And if I'm a YOLO, whatever, apples can't kill me, I have positive thoughts, right? I'll shop at the store that doesn't have any rules. I think one thing we can say is if you ask the question, well, what is it like to do business with private corporations now, right? What's the level of paperwork, bureaucracy, et cetera, with, I don't know, something like Uber, where you're getting in a random stranger's car all the time, right? There's a bunch of rules and regulations for Uber. Probably most of you have used Uber without ever reading them, right? And it's pretty effortless. There's not a lot of red tape, right? There's not even that much red tape for becoming an Uber driver. And to a certain extent, you ask, well, is it too much or too little? Well, if it's too much or too little, then Lyft or someone else will compete, right, by offering a more regulated or less regulated environment. So I think the main thing here is this reinventing the government? The argument is that it's easier to opt out of a set of contractual arrangements or regulations that you don't like than it is when those arrangements are centralized. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I feel like the laws we create right now, a lot of them are, especially like in emerging countries, the laws that our government creates are based on the contracts that companies were already creating amongst themselves, like especially in new industries.
Yeah.
Like a lot, a lot of our laws come about in like a decentralized way, and like
Yeah.
you end up realizing that like we need
100%. Also, by the way, it's now 9:10. I said this would go to 9. If you want to leave, just leave. It's totally fine. You're not at all. Yeah. I mean, you weren't obligated to be here anyway, but also like I want to give you social permission to get out of here. So yeah, your question is basically like, isn't this already like the FDA emerged? It wasn't like, I don't know, President Taft was like, haha, I have this brilliant idea, right? Like people yelled at the government because they were getting sick from food,
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. So yeah, I think to some degree the question here is, does the political process do a better or worse job than private sector processes of giving people what they want? The argument for this sort of contractual arrangement doing a better job would be the fact that it has more individual flexibility, right? So that the FDA has to make some rule, right, about sort of where do they draw the line between, especially with medical treatments, right, between having effective medical treatments and having safe medical treatments. They might say, well, we're not going to allow, new pain control drugs that have an addiction risk that's higher than existing pain control drugs, but are much more effective. You might have a chronic condition where you really prefer to have that other trade-off,
Yeah.
right? They might say, we're not going to allow a certain kind of knee implant that has a risk of creating an infection, right? But is more likely to give you sort of pain-free ability to run. And you and I might differ a lot on what we think. So because the FDA is making the decision for all of us, they've got to make the decision for the average person at best. If we have multiple different regimes that are competing with each other, then potentially those regimes can serve different customers, right?
Exactly.
That's sort of the argument in favor of this system. The argument against is, all of this assumes that people are, first of all, pretty sophisticated consumers, right? Pretty good at being able to figure out what regime they ought to be signing up for and what it is that they're signing up for, right? I think that's probably the biggest issue. And also there's the redistribution, right? It could be that the reason we want the FDA to sort of set rules for everyone is because we think that making it illegal to sell, tainted food is going to improve the quality of food that low-income people get, right? But I think the information problem is the bigger one.
Yeah.
If we think people sort of have too high of a cognitive load associated with figuring out, how big of a deal an infection risk is or whatever it is, right? Then allowing private companies to set their own rules is going to lead private companies to manipulate people in ways that hurt people, right? If we think people always do what they want, then yeah, why on earth would we have it? Right? We should deregulate everything. It's a great question. Okay, so those of you who are still here, I plan to say a little bit about Marxism.
That's what she's doing super great.
Okay, cool. You guys want to hear about Marxism?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And you're here on purpose. You're not here out of any sense of social obligation.
Yeah.
All right, great. I'm going to talk a little about Marxism. All right. Okay. So, when we talk about Marxism, there's there's a lot of moving parts to Marxism. There's a lot of things going on with Marxism, right? There's also Marxism meaning sort of the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and there's Marxism like the actual economic system that was implemented in the USSR and to some degree in China, right? So I'm going to talk more about the first one, right? Sort of the intellectual argument made by Marx and Engels, and a little bit about how that has led to the implementations of central planning, right, that we actually associate with Marxism. Okay. So Marxism emerges in the 1840s. Right, primary inspiration for the Bolshevik Party in the Russian Revolution, right, has become sort of a dominant strain of socialist thinking, of specifically communist thinking. And if we think about this sort of like, centralization, decentralization, etc., the way that I would think about Marxism is Marx's argument isn't just that sort of the ideal economic arrangement is centralized, right? That you should have central planning to decide these basic questions of like, how many workers do we have make strawberries versus blueberries? And, how do we allocate land? How do we decide who gets what? But that many of these decisions, the natural progression of market economies or of market capitalism is toward those decisions being centralized. Does that make sense? Marx's argument is essentially that decentralized market competition is not a stable end state, but rather decentralized market competition leads inevitably to more and more centralization and monopolization. And so then his argument is, if we're going to have centralization and monopolization as an end state, we should have a centralized monopoly that is in service of the mass of humanity rather than in service of a small ownership class. Okay, this makes sense? Sort of a central idea? So I want to sort of explain what this is, right? Some of these ideas by talking about two things that I think are important in Marxism. One of them is the labor theory of value, and the other one is sort of Marx's idea of sort of the end state of capitalist history, okay? And we'll talk about them somewhat together. So I want to start with labor theory of value, and I'm going to do this by going back to this allocation problem we were talking about before, this production problem, where you're deciding how much to produce with labor and how much to produce with capital, yeah? So let's say that I'm making cloth, okay? I can make cloth with a combination of workers and machinery, right? Ranging from like hand looms, right, wooden hand looms to sewing machines to sort of major production processes, right, production. And if I think about how are all the ways that I can make a certain amount of cloth, I'm gonna have an isoquant, right? I could do it with lots and lots of workers and relatively little capital. I could do it with lots and lots of capital and very few workers. I could do it with something in between, right? And if we think about sort of the traditional neoliberal, right, understanding of what firms are going to do, what they're going to do is that they're going to minimize costs, right? They're going to choose the combination of labor and capital that's cheapest. What that's going to mean if they're price takers is that they're going to choose some amount of L and K, where the MRTS, which is the marginal product of labor over the marginal product of capital, right? The relative productivity of labor and capital is equal to the relative cost of labor. Good? Okay, beautiful. And so, right, if we think about what this is going to mean for the relationship between labor and capital, for most kinds of production processes, we expect that labor and capital don't do exactly the same jobs, right? They do somewhat complementary jobs. As a consequence of that, if you add more capital to an economy, you should augment the value of labor. You should make workers more valuable. If you add more labor to an economy, you should augment the value of capital. Does this make sense? So the accumulation of capital in sort of this standard neoliberal framework, the accumulation of capital should make labor more productive, therefore should make wages higher. Does this make sense? Okay. So Marx looks at this, does a couple things. The first thing he does is he asks, what actually is this capital, this K, these sewing machines, right? The way we normally think about this is, well, okay, labor is supplied by laborers, right? People who work for a living. Capital is supplied by capitalists, right? By investors, people who own assets, right? But where did the sewing machines come from? How do we get a sewing machine? Yeah, some jabroni makes the sewing machine, right? So the first thing Marx does is he says, when we think about this relationship between labor and capital, we're actually talking about a relationship between present labor and I think he called it fossilized labor, right? Or we could think about past labor, right? We can think about two different kinds of workers contributing to this production process. Workers who make sewing machines and workers who use the sewing machines to make cloth. Does this make sense? So what we really have here is we have past labor and present labor, right? Or in sort of like classic economisty terminology, or you could think of like LT minus 1 and LT. Good? Okay, beautiful. Great. So if we think about this as being a production process that uses past labor and uses present labor, then our cost ratio here, one might imagine, is going to be the relative cost of past labor and present labor. Does this make sense? So we can imagine, I'm going to do it squiggly, because is this true? Who knows, right? We can imagine that this is going to be basically the wage of present workers relative to the wage of past workers. Does this make sense? Okay. But if this was true, right, essentially that the wage ratio for present and past workers is equal to the productivity ratio of present and past workers, that's going to mean that present workers are paid their marginal product of labor and past workers are paid their marginal product of labor, and then what's left over for the capitalists? Zilch, nothing, right? Nada. This makes sense? Yeah. So essentially what Marx says is everything is actually being produced by workers, and yet, if we look at how production is allocated, there's these people who don't really seem to do that much work and just get a bunch of shit, right? Like you've got, I don't know, like the Thomas Piketty, who's an economist who's sort of Marxist. I was looking for this quote. I think that it was the heiress for it might have been L'Oreal made more money in 1 year than Jeff Bezos in like the mid 2000s, and she didn't do anything, right? She just inherited. I mean, she did a lot of stuff, right? She played with her dog and was nice, gave interviews and stuff, but she didn't do anything for the money, right? Money passively accumulates, right? You can play this role of the investor and put your money in an index fund, and the money gets bigger over time. This makes sense? So there's got to be some disconnect here where the relative productivity here, right? Either the present workers aren't getting paid what they produce or the past workers aren't getting paid what they produce. This is essentially the argument. Does this make sense? Okay. So then we ask, okay, well, why would this be, right? How does this process make sense? How do we understand the role of capitalists in the system, right? What is it that capitalists actually do? And we might say, what Marx would say is essentially the reason that the capitalist plays a role in this, right? The reason that we don't just have a production process that uses past workers and present workers is if we think about the people who make sewing machines, right? Or even more the people who make factories. One of the consequences of making capital is if the thing that I'm producing is capital, then I'm producing something that neither I nor anyone else can eat when I'm done making it. Does this make sense? If I make a sewing machine, at the end of my labors, what I have is a lump of metal with some needles on it that's not actually immediately useful to a person. I can't sleep in it, I can't eat it, I can't cuddle up with it, right? I can't wear it, etc. Right? The reason it's useful is because somebody else is going to take that thing and actually make something with it. If I build a factory, maybe it takes me a year to build a factory, right? That means that I'm going to have workers building this factory for an entire year, not producing any output that anyone can use for an entire year. This makes sense? Maybe for 2 years if the factory then needs to operate in order to produce anything. So the question then is, what are these workers eating? Where are they sleeping? Right? How is it that they're maintaining themselves while they're doing this work that doesn't create any immediate output? Right? That only creates output well in the future. And the answer is somebody has to have a stockpile of resources for that, right? Somebody has to have food and clothing and shelter and housing in order to give these people, right? In order to have these people sustain themselves while they produce this capital, right? While these past laborers engage in a production process that's not producing output now, but is producing output in the future. This make sense? That's what a capitalist is, right? So when we talk about capital in economics, sometimes we talk about the stuff, right? The tractor or whatever, and sometimes we talk about the money. Marx is talking about the money. Right? He's saying there's people who own resources. Those resources allow them to pay people to engage in complex production processes where the ultimate output is deferred. This makes sense? And they're essential to the production. The workers can't do it themselves because the workers don't have control over those resources. That stockpile of resources. Does this make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So then, what about this shit, right? About the wages and stuff, right? So to think about this, we might ask, or Marx would make the point, that the whole point of capital, the whole reason that the stockpile of resources is important, is because not everybody has that stockpile of resources. If everyone had that stockpile of resources, we would all just make our own factories, right? Or form workers' collectives or whatever, make the factories, right? So let's imagine, to keep things really simple, let's imagine an economy where there's two ways of making cloth, right? Making fabric. One way that's available to everyone is to just use labor, right? Or use labor in really simple tools like a hand wheel, right? And if we do that, we're going to have like F of L equals L. Let's imagine we're producing $1 worth of cloth, right? Denominating in dollars worth of cloth, yeah? Then there's another way that requires you to have capital and then later productive workers, right? So you've got two periods of labor. But let's say that this production function is going to look something like this. Good? So what's going on here? What's going on here is essentially that I've got two different kinds of workers now. Collectively, they're more productive than the one kind of worker is, but only if we've got a lot of them and we have a big scale, right? If we're only using a few, we don't get anything. Yeah? Okay. And let's imagine that we have one person who actually has a stockpile of resources, one capitalist, right? And the capitalist has $100. Good? Okay. So what do we think is going to happen? Well, first of all, the people who aren't using the capitalist, right, who are ignoring the capitalist, they've got a very simple production function. Their marginal product of labor, which equals their marginal revenue product, because we're assuming that the price is 1, right, is just going to be 1. So that means that the wage rate is going to be $1. Right? This makes sense? People who work for themselves can make $1. Okay. So what the capitalist going to do? He's got $100. So let's say the capitalist says, well, I'm going to use all $100 to pay people to make capital, right? So LP is going to be 100. This makes sense? Okay. So then what am I going to do? How many future workers should I hire?
0. Like 0, you don't have enough money for.
But I'm going to be able to pay them out of the revenues, right? Because in period T plus 1, I'm going to actually make stuff and sell stuff.
Oh, okay.
This makes sense? So I only have to have stockpiles for the past workers. This is totally correct. Right? So, actually, I mean, we can calculate this, but I'm going to make, right, like, we figure out where wage equals MRP, et cetera, right? Let's just say that I'm going to set LT equals 1 equals 100 too, just to make things really easy for ourselves. Make the math really straightforward, right? So
It's gonna depend on the market, but
what?
it's gonna just depend on the market.
It's gonna depend on the market, right? I mean, what we'll actually do is we'll say then that F of 100 and LP plus 1 is gonna be 3 times 100 to the 1/2, LP plus 1 to the 1/2 minus 50, and we'll say wage equal to MRP, right? So we'll say our MRP is gonna be what this is, 1/2 times 30 LT plus 1 negative 1/2, right? Equals 1. So LT to the 1/2 would be 15, LT plus 1 would be 15 squared, which is 225. Beautiful. Okay, make sense? Awesome, awesome. So I'm gonna have 100 workers in the previous period, I'm gonna have 225 workers in the secondary period. How much stuff am I gonna make? Three times 10 times 15 minus 50, right? So that's what, Jesus, 150 times 3 is 450 minus 50, so 400, right? Yeah? Okay, so I make $400. I pay my 225 workers from the previous period, and I'm gonna end up with $175 left over, right? So I started with 100, and I ended up making 175. So that's pretty good, right? I got like a 75% return on my investment, yeah? Why is it that I was able to pay, basically what I've done now is, am I paying my workers their marginal revenue product? I'm paying my current period workers their marginal revenue product, right? That's what I did. I hired the efficient number of workers. But I'm definitely not paying my past workers their marginal revenue product, right? Yeah.
It's because they made it for you, so now you have.
That's right. And I didn't have to pay them their marginal revenue product. I'm the only person with access to this technology, this production technology. This makes sense? And so, yeah, I didn't need to pay them how much they're worth to me. I only had to pay them how much they're worth to themselves, how much they're worth in some less complex industrial process. This makes sense? So as long as there's sort of this massive pool of labor, I can make big profits by having a more productive process than everyone else because I can use capital. Once there's not infinite labor, once I start running out of labor, then I'm going to have essentially a monopoly position in the labor market. I don't have to pay people their marginal product because they don't have an alternative employer, right? I'm going to move up a labor supply curve. This makes sense? So this is essentially an argument that says, right, the reason that capital ends up being useful, capital not meaning the sewing machines or the factories, but capital meaning the stockpile of resources, is that having a stockpile of resources allows me to control a complex production process that pulls together workers across time, across space, right? Have some workers in the United States, and some workers in China, and some workers in South America, all working on the same product, right? Products that take a long time to come to realization. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So when Marx then asks, well, what is it that we expect to have happen over the course of this, right, in an economy structured like this? Well, in this case, I started with one capitalist with $100. Maybe I actually start with 100 capitalists with $100, right? So then I have a reasonably competitive labor market, right? The capitalists are going to grow their production processes until they start sucking up all the labor. Then I'm going to have 100 big companies and no independent people, right? Well, what happens then? One thing Marx would say might happen is maybe someone comes up with a more complex production process that requires even more upfront investment, right? Maybe I'm going to need multiple periods of capital investment, and instead of sort of a minimum scale of 50 or 100 workers or something like this, I'm going to have a minimum scale of 1,000 workers. The capitalists who are most productive are going to be able to afford this new production technology, the others aren't. So the new production technology is going to predominate, right? Others aren't going to be able to compete. We're going to end up with, instead of 100 capitalists, now maybe 20 capitalists. What happens then? A new, even more productive technology. Does this make sense? So his argument is essentially that this ability to, that even though we have this sort of market competition, this market competition lends itself to concentration because higher concentrations allow for greater productivity, and greater productivity wins the competition. Does this make sense? What's the ultimate end goal of all of this increased concentration, productivity, and competition? It's going to be something like a fully integrated national economy owned by a tiny or international economy, owned by a very small group of people that's mostly automated, right? That's mostly built on capital, with large groups of people, right? The LT plus one people being able to claim a very, very small part of the overall pie. And so his argument is that that's where we're going anyway, right? It's something like a centralized economy, driven by economies of scale, driven by the increased productivity of working on bigger and bigger and bigger scales. We better make sure that the masses of people get it before the sort of robot army of the one owner is badass enough to kill us all, right, and stop us from taking it from them. And that's my understanding of sort of the core connection between labor theory of value, right, and this sort of Marxist idea that the end stage of capitalism is increased concentration. Does this make sense? Okay. Now, there's a couple of assumptions about this. And I'll talk about this in a more economist, I'm putting equations and stuff. Talk about this in a more economisty way because Marx was a more economisty person, right, than a lot of the anarchist thinkers, etc. So I think the most important assumption underlying this is that there is always this more efficient technology that requires larger scale, right? We assume that there's sort of small people who have, a lower ability to produce, and then there's some larger scale that requires pulling together labor across time or across space or in just large numbers that is more productive, right? If that's not true, if there's some point where returns to scale become negative, then there isn't any sort of advantage to being a larger investor versus a smaller investor other than just being richer and having more stuff, right? There isn't this sort of eternal concentrating pressure. My read of the empirical evidence is that as of right now, I don't think that there is this infinite positive returns to scale. The reason I say that is, I think the best way to ask this question is to ask, do the largest agglomerations of financial resources, of financial capital, get better returns than small agglomerations of financial capital? And do they get better returns by investing in production processes that other smaller agglomerations don't have access to? Does this make sense? Clearly this is true if you ask the question, does Elon Musk have access to productive technologies that I don't have access to, right? If you think about the history of Tesla, Musk brought, I think, $25 million from the sale of PayPal, something like this. It took Tesla 10 years to become profitable. And that was 10 years of intensive capital and technology investment. It wouldn't have been possible to do that without large, tens of millions of dollars from investors with large seed capital. However, let's say we talk about the Harvard endowment. Harvard has an over $50 billion endowment that's managed by, centrally. Thomas Piketty, who I mentioned before, is probably one of the most prominent Marxist-ish economists working now. In the aftermath of the Great Recession, so I want to say 2013, he wrote a book where he highlighted the Harvard endowment as earning a higher return consistently than the stock market, and made this argument essentially that large agglomerations of capital have higher returns. Overall, over the last 20 years, the Harvard endowment has lagged the stock market considerably. They haven't been able to keep up with the stock market, and their strategy has been very centered on venture capital, especially venture capital internationally, which means rather than plunging their $50 billion into gigantic projects you couldn't do without $50 billion, they're actually spending their money to send consultants to East Asia and try to find mom and pop shops that make investments. Right? That's not what you would do if there's sort of always bigger scale investments that you could make that are more productive. By far the biggest agglomeration of capital that exists right now is in index funds. So have you guys heard of Vanguard? Yeah, so Vanguard is like you can put your money there, right? Like their main thing is you can buy index funds where essentially they just buy a share of every company in the stock market and they passively manage your money. It's very, very cheap. They manage $11 trillion in assets. And they don't do anything with it, right? They do exactly the same thing with the 11 trillion that you could do with a mere thousand. They don't use that money to try to build sort of larger scale companies that currently exist. Because in their view and the view of their investors, there aren't opportunities to do that are more productive, right, than investing in publicly traded companies that are current size. However, right, does that mean that Marx was wrong about this? Not necessarily, right? Something that we're seeing right now is massive investments in AI, right, on the scale of many, many billions of dollars. It's not impossible. If we think about sort of, are Marx's assumptions right? They're assumptions about the technology underlying production. Those could be wrong in the 20th century, and wrong in the first half of the 21st century, and then become right in the second half of the 21st century, right? If we end up with new possibilities unlocked by new technologies that aren't possible to access without $11 trillion, right? Okay, cool.
Wait, so
Yeah.
you're saying if like technological progress like outpaces like population growth essentially, if technological process.
It's more about does technological progress, so there's two pieces, right? The piece that I used to focus on, in terms of, which is the piece of, if you sort of come from a neoliberal perspective, you ask, what's the future for labor versus capital? The piece that's most important is essentially the shape of these isomorphs.
right? How much is labor and capital a substitute? We talked about this in labor, right? If labor becomes more of a substitute for capital, because capital becomes more human, you end up with more human-like robots, then increased concentrations of capital aren't going to raise wages by as much, and a larger share of total output goes to owners of capital. For the question, sort of the Marxist question of, is the future of capitalism full centralization, right? Is there this process that means that sort of assets get, snowballed into a small number of hands? That question is really a question about economies of scale. It's a question of whether very, very large scale, more complex processes that require more accumulated capital to pull off, are going to consistently outcompete smaller scale processes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that talking about too? Because I know that Marx talks a lot about like automation and the
Exactly.
automation of jobs. So it's like if the means of production are so advanced that you actually don't even need labor
Exactly.
anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, his sort of vision of where the future is, like a robot apocalypse, right?
Yeah.
His vision of the very, very distant future is we automate everything. And the argument is exactly like, what does it mean to gain more and more and more scale? It means that I come up with a production process that has LT, LT plus 1, LT plus 2, LT plus 4, LT plus 5, so that, if I think about there being 100 tasks, I do 99% of them with capital, which is to say with fossilized labor, and the remaining workers are only doing 1% of the tasks, right? Whereas in this production process, they're doing 100% of the tasks. That's exactly right? It looks like automation. What automation is essentially using past labor to replace present labor. Right, so if we thought about this with AI, we might say, a lot of the labor to produce, some of it is like people doing machine learning jobs, right? Like data scientists and stuff. Some of it is also, it's hard to think about this as labor because we're not getting paid for it, right? But like people who have made Reddit comments, right? Explaining like how to fix a toilet that are being used to train, large language models that could eventually know how to fix a toilet or understand how toilets work, right? People who have written books, right? That are teaching large language models how to write. Right, that's essentially fossilized labor that's now becoming automated in large language models. So that, yeah, exactly, right? Like if we think about what is Marx arguing, Marx is arguing that this sort of ever intensification of capital is more productive, right, than other forms of production. The argument falls apart if essentially the most efficient scale of production is still small enough that there's large numbers of people who can finance, or combinations of people who can finance projects on that scale and are still competing with each other. Does that make sense?
Well,
Yeah.
So you're saying that automation is making Marxist theory more likely to be true?
Exactly.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, so Marx's theory is really centered on automation.
Okay.
That's right. So I think from a Marxist perspective, the rise of artificial intelligence is like the thing that's been anticipated since the 1840s, right? As an economy where human beings are replaced. Yeah, that's like the Marxist robot apocalypse.
Because you got so philosophical about how capital literally takes over your body and it's like gonna be the gonna control all of your life, and it's like AI where it's like
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the thing is like, if we think about sort of what has happened, so instead of talking about the next 100 years, if we talk about the last 100 years, the thing that has absolutely, undeniably happened is an intensification of capital use in the economy, right? We are a much more capital-intensive economy now than we were 100 years ago. A typical person's job involves much more interface with machinery, software, et cetera, that's productivity augmenting, and lots of jobs have been replaced, right? If we think about the jobs that existed in 1925, my guess is at least 95% of them have been automated. However, if we think about how the economy has changed from 1925 to now, what hasn't happened is what Marx called the immiseration of the working class. Standards of living for normal people have not fallen from 1925 to now, especially if we're thinking about the United States or developed countries, that's certainly true. If we think globally, it's still pretty true. Standards of living definitely fell during the 1800s in sub-Saharan Africa, but for the last 100 years, standards of living have been rising along. So to some degree, traditional neoclassical argument would be, well, you intensify capital, right? You add more capital per worker, that's going to make workers more productive, it's going to increase their wages. If we have something closer to a complementary relationship between labor and capital, intensification of capital isn't just going to increase workers' wages, it's also going to increase the share of production that goes to workers. That hasn't happened, right? The share of production on workers has stayed about constant or falling a little bit. But that's consistent with something like a Cobb-Douglas production function, right? Balanced technological growth. That if we projected that forward for the next 100 years, we would imagine that in 100 years, a lot of what we think of now as work wouldn't be done by people, but people would still be doing work and they would be making a lot more money as a result of it, right? Maybe we would have an economy where we're mostly giving each other massages and singing to each other and right telling each other stories, and people aren't working in factories because that's all automated. People aren't serving food because that's all automated, etc. Right?
Wait, so you're
Yeah.
saying that exponent on like the labor and capital, when you have a labor and capital, like
Yeah.
the fact that 2/3 of the
Yeah.
money is still going to labor, that hasn't changed for the past 100 years.
Exactly. So if we thought about, well, and that's actually not, that's a very controversial question.
Yeah.
It's a very controversial question that gets down to a really nitpicky measurement question.
But that's what the debate is, though.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if we thought that we had something like an aggregate production function that looks like this, right? An aggregate production function that looks something like this. The implication of this would be that no matter how much capital we add to the economy, workers are going to get about 2/3 of total output, and capital is going to get about 1/3 of total output. So if you intensify capital, you're going to lower the returns on capital, right? We actually haven't seen capital returns fall, but we add like the technological growth, right, component to this, and we say, well, technological growth is growing fast at the same rate as capital, right? That's right. This would have intensification of capital, it would have automation of jobs, but it wouldn't have immiseration of workers.
Yeah.
Right? If what we have instead is growing monopoly power, then you're going to have an increasing gap between the production, right, the productive capacity of labor and wages of workers. What you're also going to have, right, as we've talked about in labor economics, is you're going to have firms hire what look like an inefficiently small number of workers. They're going to hire fewer workers in order to keep wages down and get away with that by automating even more.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's essentially the argument isn't, are we going to have more automation? The argument is automation going to lead to increased or decreased standards of living for workers?
Yeah.
Over the last 100 years, I think the evidence is pretty clear that it's led to increased standards of living. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily what will happen in the next 100 years. Yeah.
I saw a graph that like starting in the 80s, labor productivity like skyrocketed.
Yeah.
But wages remained relatively the same.
Yeah.
Is that a misleading graph, or does it kind of contradict the idea that the ratio that goes to capital and labor stayed the same?
It's very complicated. Which is an obnoxious. So there's a couple of major issues that go into this question empirically, right? Was the 1980s this period where you saw not just definitely it was a period of increasing inequality. The question of was it a period of increasing inequality between capital and labor? There's a couple of measurement problems that make this hard, right? That sort of shape this debate. One question is, what do you do with healthcare? The reason that's important is because in the United States, employers tend to pay for workers' healthcare. So if we look at people's wages, right, increasing healthcare costs are not going to increase people's wages. They are going to increase the value of someone's compensation. This makes sense because if I'm getting paid $80,000 and I'm also getting a healthcare benefit that costs $20,000, whereas 10 years ago that cost $10,000, I've actually increased my compensation by $10,000. This makes sense? Especially if we think of rising healthcare costs, it's like an increase in the quality of healthcare rather than just an increase in cost, right? So that's one big thing is how do you price in these non-wage amenities, especially healthcare? How do you assign those, right? And one of the things that's tricky about doing that is it would be pretty easy if employer-provided healthcare was marginal, because then we could just ask, well, how much do people pay for healthcare, for health insurance who don't have employer-provided healthcare? As it is, the private market for health insurance is really small, and it's quite different from the employer-provided market. So it's difficult to really know like the value to workers of the healthcare policies they're getting. So that's one thing. If you add in healthcare, that makes those two lines much more similar. There's also a debate about how to account for inflation. This is very kind of nitty gritty and irritating. But the graph that you're referring to, and this is from memory, I might have the details wrong, right? But the graph that you're referring to uses a different inflation calculation for labor productivity than it does for GDP growth. If I remember right, the GDP growth deflator was using a producer production index. Basically, how much do prices of inputs change over time? And the wage was using a consumer price index deflator. Consumer prices have, if I remember right, consumer prices have grown more than producer prices over the last 40 years. Basically because manufactured goods have gotten a lot cheaper. And so as a result, like some of that divergence is that we're like accounting for inflation differently. Again, I might be remembering the details of that wrong. The last piece of this, which is also a little bit messy and has become more important over time, is what to do with sole proprietors or partners. So if we think about, what is labor income and what is capital income? For me, it's pretty straightforward. All of the money I make is labor income because I don't own an Occidental College at all, right? But let's say that I am an accountant who owns my own accounting firm, and I pay myself a salary, but also the accounting firm that I own, like, has a value, and that value appreciates, right? And I get dividends for the value of my accounting firm. How much is capital income and how much is labor income? It's a little bit tricky, right? It's very difficult to separate out the value of me working at my own firm versus the value of the firm or the assets that the firm owns. This gets especially tricky because if you sort of ask, well, how do people report their incomes on their taxes? People have an incentive to report income as capital income because it's taxed at a lower rate. And those differences in rates have increased over time. And the rules for how you can report capital income have changed over time. So some people say a lot of that divergence is driven by relatively high income people who are sole proprietors or have business ownership, reporting a lot of their earned income as capital income. And if you try to adjust for that, that changes the way that we do this. The last thing, and sorry, this is so in the weeds, and also you'll have to check me and make sure this is true. But the last piece of this that gets complicated is Reagan era tax reform in the 1980s changed a lot of the rules for income reporting and tax reporting. This is more about income inequality between workers than it is about labor versus capital. But one of the consequences of that is that very high income people reported more of their taxes or more of their income after the Reagan tax reforms because they were paying lower tax rates, right? So if I could avoid taxes by like redirecting some of my money through the Bahamas, or like instead of getting paid a wage, like have my company buy me a car or a house or something, that was more worth doing in 1979 than it was in 1983. Does that make sense? So sorry, that's a very long-winded answer. The basic answer here is the calculations of this that I trust the most, not being an expert on these measurement questions, suggests that the share of income going to workers has fallen over this period from about, if I remember right, about like 70% to like 67%, something like that. And definitely inequality among wage earners has increased. Yeah. Other thoughts, other questions?
But you're saying basically that the reason why we're not seeing what Marx is saying that of like everything just concentrating into one monopoly is because like capitalism and money is being allocated not only to big companies but also the small companies, and it's constantly like. So how do you think that's changed? Like the amount of investment that's been funneled into big companies or small companies.
So the argument is basically that the reason that we don't, or the argument against Marx's predictions is that the productivity advantage of bigness tapers off, right? So that if you think about the largest companies in the world, the largest companies in the world are not producing at lower cost than their smaller competitors, right? And aren't better investments than their smaller competitors.
Yeah.
So your question is basically like, what's happened to essentially, how has the bigness of companies changed over time?
Yeah.
Right?
And how do we analyze?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I don't have a great answer. I mean, there's a couple ways that you can think about this question. The easiest way to think about this question is to just look at publicly traded companies where we have tons of data. All of them are big, right?
Yeah.
But this is a question of like big versus massive companies. And ask essentially like how much of the stock market is the top 10 companies.
Yeah.
Something like this. I don't actually know the answer to that question.
Uh-huh.
One thing that I do know is true is that the top 10 companies now are largely not the top 10 companies of 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Right, many of the largest companies in the world now didn't exist in the recent past, right? And so you don't see this sort of like the largest agglomerations of capital like pioneering new industries and getting bigger.
Yeah.
In fact, what you tend to see is that very large companies stop being particularly innovative.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the easiest thing. Then the next harder thing is to ask basically the size of private companies versus publicly traded companies.
Mhm.
And then you can talk about something like truly small companies, like sole proprietorships, family-owned businesses, right? Like partnerships versus versus corporations. Um, there are, I mean, anecdotally, in many industries, there's been a roll-up of small mom and pop shops.
Yeah, well, like real estate also, for example.
Exactly. So especially in the 80s, there was a big, sort of a big boom in mergers and acquisitions. The big companies definitely got bigger. Some of that was regulatory. The regulatory administration changed the way that we do antitrust to make it much easier to make big companies. In a lot of like car, mechanics, for example, much larger share of auto mechanics now than 30 years ago are large chains. My wife's a veterinarian, so I think about veterinary medicine a lot. Much larger percentage of veterinary practices are owned by corporations than were 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. And a lot of the reason for this is a combination of, especially with mechanics branding, right, like Pep Boys has a national brand, et cetera. But also advantages that bigger companies have in price setting, business analysis, and supply chain.
Yeah.
Right, so like Pep Boys can get oil for oil changes cheaper than mom and pop auto mechanics can, and they can do that because they have monopoly power, right? So they can make deals with the big companies to get lower prices. That's an example of the sort of process Marx is talking about. So you definitely see this happen. It's just what you don't really see happening is like Pep Boys rolling up like a lot of the auto mechanic industry and then moving from that to rolling up every industry. Yeah. So yeah, this is exactly the sort of question you want to ask. Other questions, other thoughts?
I mean, hasn't maybe I'm not like
No.
familiar with all this stuff, but it
Yeah.
kind of does seem like a lot of just thinking about the biggest like companies in the world.
Yeah.
They just like own more and more, and especially with like conglomerates and all of that. And so I kind of see what you're saying of like because like lots of different variations of
Yeah.
this still exists, and like
Yeah.
you can still have a very very successful small business.
Right.
But like if like
Yeah.
small companies are owning more and more and more of like all the media we consume,
Totally.
all the grocery stores, like
Totally.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
Then that is a kind of accumulation.
Absolutely. And no, I appreciate you pushing back on this too, because this argument doesn't say, right, this argument doesn't say that like day one have an elimination of all competition. Right? It's an argument about sort of the medium to distant future. So absolutely, if you think about like Disney buying up such a large percentage of entertainment, right? You can have sufficient competition to keep prices low up until you don't. Right? And then once you don't, you could have yourself right in a recognizably different situation here.
But then you could just regulate stuff.
So yeah, so I mean, okay, so that's right. So I think there's a couple pieces to this. If we think that Marx's analysis was correct on the sort of like laws of motion of capitalism, unregulated capitalism, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to get rid of capitalism.
Yeah.
So I mentioned before, like in terms of the history, right? The Bolsheviks that turned into the leaders of the USSR, they were originally, the name was the Russian Social Democratic Party. Pretty much every country in Western Europe has a Social Democratic Party. The Social Democrats were essentially just socialists who used the democratic process, right? And participated in elections. So the German Social Democrats were the biggest of the Social Democratic parties. They're still one of the biggest parties in Germany. And they essentially are a party that was founded on the same understanding of how capitalism works as the Bolsheviks. But their conclusion about what to do about it was that you need to have a strong state that engages in a lot of redistribution, controls large companies to stop them from behaving in ways that are socially non-optimal, right? And protects, limits too much accumulation, right? Essentially, you ride the tiger, right? You allow this sort of decentralized process of accumulation to happen, but you recognize, you basically treat it as something that if it's left alone, it's going to go haywire. So you put strict regulations on it.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, that's, the economy that Germany has now, a lot of their institutions were built on that understanding, right? Germany is a capitalist country, right? That has a market economy. So yeah, you might basically accept this basic analysis and think instead of sort of seizing the means of production as workers, we can just sort of like make sure we control the government and have the government seize as much of the means of production as necessary to keep things from going off the rails, right? That's a perfect, I think, a perfectly reasonable analysis. That's actually something. There's a conservative writer, Jonah Goldberg, that is very capitalist, and he's written things that are essentially bad. Says capitalism by itself is a disaster, but capitalism plus democracy works really well. Yeah. So there's a question of like empirically, is this true? And then there's a question of what do you do about it? Yeah.
I guess like the pushback to that would be like capitalists like corrupt democracy, and
Yeah.
like, I kind of see like the rollback of
Yeah.
a lot of those institutions, like the UK.
So yeah, absolutely. And this is something. This was an idea that underlied a lot of how the Biden administration did antitrust. So I mentioned this before that part of the reason that big companies got bigger in the 80s is that the way that basically the Reagan administration adopted rules around antitrust, right? Not allowing companies to buy their competitors that were centered on consumer prices. So the idea was essentially that if you're going to say that, Disney buying ABC is anti-competitive, you need to show that it will hurt consumers for Disney to buy ABC. Before that, the rules were a lot more ad hoc. They were much more about like a general sense that companies shouldn't get, get past a certain percentage of their industry or a certain percentage of their industry locally, et cetera. The Biden administration made an argument for essentially restoring some of that earlier version of antitrust, coming from what you're saying. Essentially saying having large companies be sufficiently big in their industries creates a threat to democracy. I was just reading before coming here about the cryptocurrency industry put pretty unprecedented amounts of money to the 2024 election. In the scale of hundreds of millions of dollars, directed against people who wanted to regulate cryptocurrency. Plenty of people do want to regulate cryptocurrency, but they don't necessarily want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars about it. Right? And very few people vote on crypto regulation. And so that's a pretty effective way of making sure that the government doesn't regulate crypto.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons that you might not trust democracy to be essentially a guardrail, if you believe in this sort of natural tendency of capitalism towards ever-growing inequality or accumulation, is that maybe it works until it doesn't. Right? It works until accumulation reaches a certain point where the power of the oligarchs is bigger than the power of the people of those. Yeah.
Yeah, because like Gabe, I feel like what you were saying is that we're like reaching what Marx was saying, not because bigger companies are getting more and more productive,
Right.
but because like they're just become more and more powerful. They can just like
Yeah.
everybody.
So right. So I mean, this is also to some degree this goes back to what we were talking about with anarcho-capitalism, right? If that's the worry, right? If the worry is not Disney is buying up all the media because Disney just runs media companies better than anybody else, and you just can't compete with them because of their scale. And instead, what you say is, and this is unfair to Detroit. I'm not trying to accuse Disney, but Disney is buying up all the media because Disney has all sorts of corrupt handshake relationships with politicians and uses the political process to punish their rivals. And right, like any company that goes afoul of Disney is going to have problems with the FCC, or all of these various arms of the government. Then potentially what you're saying is that the regulatory state isn't the solution to this problem, it is the problem, right? And the argument would be then that cutting back on the regulatory state gives, large concentrations of capital fewer tools that they can use to write the rules in their own favor.
And you can attack them more like another company can attack them much more viciously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So the argument would be, okay, well, if monopolies aren't more productive,
Yeah.
but they're more politically powerful, then reduce politics, right? Get politics back, and then you can have market competition, and that limits monopolies.
Yeah, because in anarcho-capitalism, the point is that you have to be productive.
Exactly.
Like if you have to be
Exactly.
maximum efficiency.
And empirically, the argument for that would be to say, if you look at countries that have very extreme inequality in wealth, and especially have sort of very, very large concentrations of capital in single companies or single families, most of them are countries with pretty large states that are pretty corrupt.
Yeah.
Right? Russia has pretty high levels of inequality and a lot controlled by a small number of oligarchs. All of them are politically connected.
Yeah.
Right? The same is true of a lot of countries in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, et cetera. I guess they want it out of here. Yeah.
That's fine. I've never seen that before.
Been here past 10.
Yeah. Let's do it.